What if every royal love story was actually a power grab in disguise? Behind the velvet curtains and golden crowns lies a history far messier than fairy tales dare admit, where kings marry their brothers' widows, queens replace their own sisters, and the line between family and lover dissolves into scandal. This isn't gossip, it's strategy. For centuries, monarchs used their in-laws like chess pieces, calculated, expendable, and dangerously close. So forget romance. This is royalty at its most intimate, and its most unsettling. 25 royals who slept with their in-laws. You've never seen dynasties like this. Before we dive into the tangled royal bedsheets of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel. This rabbit hole only gets deeper from here. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, 3 a.m. in Manchester. We want to know who's out there unraveling history with us in the dark. Henry VIII of England. It began, as most royal sins do, with a loophole, a technicality, a bit of interpretive gymnastics in the margins of Leviticus. When young Henry Tudor ascended to the English throne in 1509, he inherited more than just a crown, he inherited a theological conundrum. His older brother, Arthur, had died years earlier after a brief, ceremonial marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess imported as part of a carefully brokered alliance. Henry, ever the dutiful second son turned accidental heir, was left with a widow in waiting, or perhaps more accurately, a politically valuable womb. Catherine claimed the marriage with Arthur had never been consummated. She swore it in writing. She swore it before God. The papal bulls confirmed it. But Henry's conscience, or at least his ego, would not rest so easily. And so began one of the most consequential marriages in Western history. A man took his dead brother's wife, called it divine destiny, and built an empire on top of a technical clause. Officially, Henry married Catherine out of love. Unofficially, he married her because Spain had ships, money, and a grudge against France. The match was politically advantageous and theologically justifiable if you ignored the bits of scripture that said things like, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife," Leviticus 18. But never mind. A convenient papal dispensation paved the way, and the wedding bells chimed over a kingdom already brewing with quiet tension. The irony? Henry was deeply religious. Not spiritual, mind you. Religious. The kind of man who would later burn you for heresy with one hand and write a defense of Catholic doctrine with the other. The kind of monarch who thought himself both God's sword and his anointed son. The problem with divine favor, though, is that it tends to become selective and eventually conditional. For the first few years, the marriage seemed functional. Henry and Catherine played the royal couple well dancing, hunting, putting on a good Tudor face. But the real drama wasn't above the waistline. It was in the nursery. Catherine couldn't give him a son. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lasted weeks. Only one child survived the gauntlet of early modern mortality, Mary, a daughter. And in Henry's mind, a theological thorn. If God had blessed this union, where was the heir? If the marriage had been truly clean, truly sanctioned, why did every cradle come with a coffin? Henry began to wonder loudly, publicly, if he had sinned. Not morally, of course. Legally. Scripturally. Perhaps marrying his brother's wife had, in fact, been an affront to God. Perhaps Leviticus had been right all along. Perhaps the papal dispensation had been a clerical error. Or perhaps Henry just wanted someone else now. What followed was not just a crisis of marriage. It was a crisis of empire. a spiraling, bloody undoing of every tie that bound England to Rome. In seeking to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry didn't just defy the Pope, he created a new church, made himself its head, and inaugurated a century of Protestant Catholic violence that would leave England gasping for religious air. But at the root of it all was this: he had married his brother's widow, and when things fell apart, he used that fact like a scalpel cutting through centuries of doctrine, diplomacy, and blood. Did he believe the marriage was cursed, or was it just a convenient exit ramp? Historians are still split. What's clear is that Henry never quite escaped the shadow of that first union. His later obsession with annulments, succession, and purity laws all seem to orbit the same theological black hole. He had started with his brother's wife, and in doing so, cracked open the entire moral infrastructure of European monarchy. But what makes Henry's story so unnerving isn't that he sinned. It's that he legislated the sin, justified it, canonized it, then flipped the script and condemned it when it stopped serving him. He didn't just sleep with his sister-in-law, he weaponized the relationship, then built an empire on the wreckage of its collapse. And yet, this is only Act 1 of his tangled domestic diplomacy. Because before Catherine, there was another woman, another in-law, another forbidden intimacy buried in the footnotes of history, one that would quietly haunt the court long after heads had rolled. Her name was Mary Boleyn, and she was not his wife. She was her sister, Henry VIII of England. Before he crowned himself as the spiritual head of England or dissolved monasteries, or sent queens to the block, Henry VIII was simply a young man with a charming smile, a muscular frame, and a frustrating sense of entitlement. He believed that he was chosen, not in the poetic, meant for greatness sense, no, chosen by God, endorsed by scripture, and occasionally footnoted by papal bulls. In this belief, he was not unique among kings, but he was unusually committed to making theology bend toward his personal life. And nothing bent harder than the Bible verse he famously twisted to marry his brother's widow, Leviticus 20:21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. The phrase haunted Henry, not because he believed in biblical literalism, but because it offered a loophole wrapped in moral drama. The union with Catherine of Aragon had produced no living son, therefore it must be cursed. Or better, unlawful, illegitimate, destined for annulment. Never mind that Catherine swore, time and again, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Henry knew better, or rather, needed to. Because theological guilt gave him what lust could not, an exit. At the center of this story is not just an aging queen and a king with a fragile ego. It's the concept of affinity, a moral and legal framework in canon law that equated in-laws with blood relatives. Marrying your brother's widow wasn't merely awkward, it was, in the eyes of many, incestuous. And while exceptions could be made, and were, often, the specter of uncovering a brother's nakedness lingered like smoke in a chapel. What makes this case especially ironic is how publicly it played out. The question of whether Henry had sinned by marrying Catherine was not just a dinner table debate, it was the foundation of England's Reformation. An entire kingdom was pulled apart by an argument that started with a dead brother's wedding night. To put it differently, Henry VIII didn't just sleep with his sister-in-law, he rearranged Europe because of it. Catherine, to her credit, never blinked. She held her ground in court, in exile, in correspondence. She maintained her title, her dignity, and her daughter's legitimacy until the very end. If Henry had hoped for a quiet exit, he chose the wrong queen. She outlasted his patience and his libido, and probably his conscience. But behind the drama of their marriage lies a deeper truth. For kings, in-law relationships were always a political tool first, a spiritual concern second, and a personal mess third. Henry's union with Catherine was never just about love or even duty. It was about control over succession, over papal authority, and over the perception that he had divine sanction for everything he did, even when it was morally ambiguous. Still, his story doesn't end with Catherine, because long before Anne Boleyn entered the scene, her sister had already been there. Mary Boleyn, the quiet shadow. She doesn't get the grand titles or the tragic sonnets. Her face isn't carved into memorial plaques or painted in symbolic oils. But she was there before the crowns, before the trials, before the break from Rome. Mary Boleyn was, by many accounts, Henry's first known mistress at court. And unlike Catherine, she was alive, unwed at the time, and crucially, the sister of his future queen. The affair with Mary is not as well documented as Henry's 6 marriages, but it left its fingerprints all over Tudor politics. Whispers in foreign embassies, recorded stipends, sudden marriages arranged to cover scandal. The evidence is circumstantial, but the consensus among historians is firm. Henry VIII likely had a romantic and physical relationship with Mary Boleyn years before Anne ever caught his eye. Which means that when he later pursued Anne, he wasn't just courting a lady-in-waiting, he was doubling down on the Boleyn family, wrapping himself in the same house that had already entertained his lust. And in canon law, that mattered. Because if you've known a woman, you're not supposed to marry her sister. Not under Catholic doctrine, not if you take affinity seriously. But Henry, of course, did not take affinity seriously, except when it suited him. He used it to annul Catherine. He ignored it to marry Anne. And in doing so, he revealed the entire system for what it truly was. A chessboard. Affinity, legitimacy, marriage. They were pieces to be moved. And Henry was playing both sides of the board. The twist? His relationship with Mary Boleyn may have permanently complicated his later union with Anne. The Pope, when petitioned for yet another marriage dispensation, balked. How many Boleyn sisters could one king marry? And if he had already been intimate with one, how could he marry the other without violating scripture once again? But by then, Henry was done asking permission. He had broken the church, named himself supreme head, and rewritten the rules of spiritual order in England. He had divorced one sister-in-law, ignored the scandal of another, and crowned the younger sibling in a coronation that reeked of poetic spite. Anne Boleyn, once the bold mistress, was now the queen. And Mary, shoved into the footnotes, useful, embarrassing, and entirely inconvenient. The Boleyn affair would echo through every marriage that followed, every annulment, every accusation, every whispered curse in the court hallways. Henry had tasted blood in the water, and from that moment on, affinity was no longer a moral boundary. It was a bureaucratic speed bump. But while Henry mastered the art of justifying his in-law entanglements, others weren't so careful. In France, another monarch faced a scandal that was less theological and more whispered. He didn't marry his in-law, he simply shared too many late-night conversations with her in Versailles Gardens. They called him the Sun King, and her simply Madame. And if you're still here after that little Tudor family entanglement, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got 23 more royal complications to untangle. And while you're watching, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it over there? Are you in a sunny cafe or deep in a late night scroll? We want to know who's keeping the crown company in the shadows. Louis XIV of France. It was, as ever, a matter of optics. Versailles was a hall of mirrors in more ways than one. Beneath the chandeliers and sculpted ceilings, truth refracted through gold leaf and gossip. Here, love affairs were not hidden, they were choreographed. But even in a palace built to stage managed scandal, some relationships stretched the limits of plausible deniability. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not exactly a man known for restraint. He was France's living deity, dancing at dawn in court ballets, sermonizing through architecture, and waging wars that doubled as theatre. Everything about him glowed: his clothes, his court, his myth. But sometimes, even the brightest light casts a long shadow. And in that shadow stood Henrietta of England. Known at Versailles as Madame, she was the sister of Charles II of England, and more crucially, the wife of Louis's brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans. A marriage of diplomacy, certainly, but not one of warmth. Henrietta was charming, intelligent, and visibly miserable. Philippe was flamboyant, openly hostile, and frequently surrounded by his favourites' male courtiers who competed for his affection with theatrical flair and the occasional duel. Theirs was a marriage of spectacle and bitterness, and Louis, ever the central star, couldn't help but gravitate toward the glow of his sister-in-law's discontent. What began as courtly familiarity, walks in the gardens, conversations in the salons, matured very quickly into something else. The courtiers whispered and the court poets implied, and though France never saw an official declaration of their relationship, the intimacy between Louis and Madame pulsed beneath every fan flutter and masked ball. They were always together, always talking, always not quite pretending. The danger of an affair like this wasn't just the optics, it was the implications. Sleeping with a noblewoman, common. Taking a mistress, expected. But taking up with your brother's wife, that was something else. That threatened not just family harmony, but dynastic stability. It raised the spectre of illegitimate heirs, poisoned alliances, and royal hypocrisy, the kind of hypocrisy Versailles was supposed to gild over, not amplify. And yet, Louis persisted. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was politics. Maybe it was just boredom wrapped in lace. Whatever it was, the affair, if we can call it that, and most historians do, was an open secret. Foreign diplomats wrote about it in their dispatches. English envoys flinched. French bishops said nothing. Henrietta, for her part, played her role with finesse. She was fluent in charm and devastating in wit. She wrote letters to her brother Charles filled with veiled warnings about court intrigues and marital miseries. She bore children for Philippe, though which ones belonged to whom is still debated in hushed academic tones. And through it all, she kept up appearances. Her eyes always just a bit too bright at court functions, her smile a little too practiced. The turning point came in 1670. Henrietta died suddenly, at age 26, just days after helping negotiate the Treaty of Dover between England and France. Officially, it was said to be from peritonitis caused by drinking cold water after exercise. Unofficially, it was said to be poison. And behind the rumours was a web of possible suspects: jealous courtiers, political rivals, or perhaps a royal family cleaning up an inconvenient narrative. Louis, by all accounts, was devastated. His grief was performative, of course it was, but it also seemed real. Versailles paused, the mirrors dulled. In the years that followed, the relationship between Louis and his brother never quite recovered. Philippe continued to play the part of the extravagant, sidelined duke, retreating further into scandal and sulk. And Louis? He moved on, as kings do. Other mistresses came and went, some grand, some tragic, all carefully framed within the parameters of acceptable infidelity. None, however, carried quite the same charged taboo as Henrietta. Because Henrietta had not just been a mistress, she had been family, bound by law, title, and diplomacy. A sister-in-law, a duchess, a queen's daughter, a political bridge between nations. And yet, in the soft filtered light of Versailles, she was reduced to an asterisk. Another woman loved too publicly and mourned too neatly. The episode leaves a faint perfume of contradiction. Louis XIV, the king who micromanaged everything from war councils to curtain tassels, couldn't or wouldn't stop this particular proximity. He let it bloom, he let it rot, and then he let it vanish beneath layers of protocol and marble. But it lingered, not just in scandal sheets, but in the architecture of Versailles itself. The rooms Henrietta used were reassigned, redecorated, renamed, as though changing the wallpaper could erase what had happened inside, as though the walls themselves didn't remember. And yet, Louis was lucky, because while he tangled hearts within the fragile web of courtly diplomacy, he at least had the luxury of ambiguity. No formal charges, no papal interventions, no reformation. Other monarchs were not so fortunate. In the East, a ruler would take an even bolder step, not bedding a sister-in-law, but outright claiming his own son's wife as his imperial consort. And in Tang Dynasty China, they didn't call it scandal, they called it poetry. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang China. It is difficult to overstate the grandeur of the Tang Dynasty at its peak. It was the cultural zenith of imperial China, a kingdom of cosmopolitan splendor, silk-draped diplomacy, and poetry that still echoes in modern ink. But as with most golden ages, beneath the surface shimmered a darker thread of contradictions. Power moved through bloodlines, palaces became mazes of desire and duty, and emperors divine in name, human in appetite, could make decisions that rewrote the moral boundaries of their time. Enter Emperor Xuanzong, born Li Longji, the sovereign who presided over the Tang Dynasty's most illustrious chapter, and also, paradoxically, one of its most infamous declines. He was a patron of the arts, a reformer in his youth, a ruler who once sought harmony between Taoist mysticism and Confucian order. But his name would ultimately be remembered not for his administrative reforms, nor for his early victories, but for a single relationship that blurred the lines between love, ambition, and a final taboo. Her name was Yang Yuhuan. She is better known to posterity as Yang Guifei, precious consort Yang, and in the minds of later poets and storytellers, she became China's Helen of Troy, the woman whose beauty brought down an empire. The truth, as always, is messier, and far more morally awkward. Yang Yuhuan was originally married to Li Mao Xuanzong's son, a minor prince in the imperial lineage. Li Mao wasn't poised for major influence, but his marriage to Yang Yuhuan seemed typical enough, an alliance between noble families, unremarkable in a court saturated with concubines, bureaucrats, and minor titles. But the emperor noticed her. Some said it was her voice, she was trained in music. Others claimed it was her bearing, a kind of poised warmth that set her apart in a palace of icy formalism. Whatever the reason, Xuanzong's attention shifted. And when an emperor shifts his attention, reality tends to rearrange itself. Of course, there was a problem. She was his daughter-in-law. Even in a dynasty known for its complex family trees and ceremonial flexibility, this was a step too far. Confucian ethics were clear. Fathers do not encroach upon their sons' households. To desire your son's wife was to invert the natural order, a disruption not just of propriety, but of cosmic balance. In imperial China, that mattered. But where ethics resisted, ritual provided a loophole. Before Yang Yuhuan could become Xuanzong's consort, she was quietly tonsured, a forced transition into Taoist religious life. Officially, she became a nun, severing her marriage ties in the eyes of the court. Symbolically, she was no longer a daughter-in-law. She had exited the family structure. A new identity made space for a new role. And then she was brought back, rebranded, elevated, renamed. She became Yang Guifei, one of the four beauties of ancient China, and Xuanzong's favored consort. Not his wife. Emperors rarely remarried after an empress, but something more potent, a presence, an institution. She held no formal political office, but her influence saturated the court. Her family, the Yang clan, surged in rank and favor. Her cousin Yang Guozhong rose to the role of chancellor, wielding power with theatrical arrogance. The court watched. The ministers murmured. The empire, at first, tolerated it. After all, emperors were expected to be above ordinary concerns. If Xuanzong wanted to elevate a former daughter-in-law to the highest consort rank, then perhaps it was simply heaven's will, refracted through desire. But desire has consequences, especially when it governs governance. As Xuanzong aged, his attention narrowed to Yang Guifei and the pleasures of the palace. The bureaucracy faltered, military leadership frayed, and on the western frontiers, a general named An Lushan grew restless. By the time the An Lushan rebellion exploded in 755, the Tang Empire was rotting from within. While historians debate the exact causes, economic mismanagement, over-centralization, factionalism, the symbolic scapegoat became Yang Guifei. It was said her family's corruption had weakened the state, that her influence blinded the emperor, that her elevation was the original moral fracture. And here lies the irony. Xuanzong's most politically disastrous decision began not with treaties or tax policies, but with an in-law relationship. A moment of personal preference that violated deeply embedded norms of filial hierarchy and familial structure. He didn't just take a woman, he took his son's wife, rewrote her role, and elevated her beyond reproach. But the empire remembered. The rebellion forced Xuanzong to flee the capital. Soldiers demanded that Yang Guifei be executed as the price of loyalty. And though the historical records differ in tone, most agree. She was strangled during the retreat, a sacrificial offering to restore political order. Xuanzong lived on, abdicated, and died in relative obscurity. The Tang dynasty would recover partially but never fully. The myth of Yang Guifei only grew. In poetry, she became the tragic beauty. In theatre, the doomed romantic. In textbooks, the symbol of overreach. But at the heart of the story is a broken taboo. A ruler who claimed his son's wife. A man who rerouted filial duty for personal desire, and in doing so may have cracked the foundations of one of history's great empires. And yet, the Tang were not alone in bending family lines for power and passion. Centuries earlier, in a Hellenistic court drenched in incense and paranoia, another ruler would fall in love with someone he was absolutely not supposed to touch. And in that case, the diagnosis came not from scripture, but from a physician, Antiochus I of the Seleucid Empire. In the sun-baked libraries of ancient Syria and Anatolia, historians recorded a tale that sounded more like a fable than fact, a royal scandal so emotionally dramatic, so symbolically fraught, that it slipped quietly from history into legend. And yet, it happened. Or something very much like it happened. And what makes it more unsettling is not just that it was real, but that it was treated, at the time, as a kind of romantic inevitability. Antiochus the First Soter, the heir of Seleucus the First Nicator, was not born into a quiet family. The Seleucid dynasty was one of the many post-Alexandrian kingdoms carved from the corpse of an empire, its borders constantly shifting, its throne secured not by divine right but by military pragmatism. Seleucus. I was a survivor among cutthroats, an ex-bodyguard turned general turned king, holding together a kingdom that spanned from Asia Minor to the edges of India. He ruled with a sword in one hand and a diplomatic marriage certificate in the other. One of those marriages was to Stratonice of Syria, an influential royal woman, the daughter of Demetrius I of Macedon, and a useful alliance in the fluid world of Hellenistic power. Seleucus married her as part of a political chess move, consolidating ties with rival families and producing heirs to stabilize his hold. So far, so expected. Then came the illness. Antiochus, the crown prince, grew pale. He stopped eating. His strength faded. His mood collapsed. The doctors were summoned. Incantations were performed. No one knew what afflicted him. Some mysterious ailment that seemed to worsen each time he saw his father or entered the court. He was, by all accounts, dying. Enter Erasistratus, a Greek physician, known more for his anatomical studies than his courtly instincts. He observed Antiochus with a clinician's detachment, and what he noticed was not a virus, or a fever, or a curse. It was pulse. Elevated when a certain woman entered the room, shaky hands, flushed cheeks. The signs weren't just physical, they were poetic. The boy was, apparently, in love, but not just with anyone, with Stratonice, his stepmother. To be clear, this was not a fairy tale kingdom with casual definitions of family. This was a deeply honor-driven society, one that held loyalty to both blood and propriety as essential for political survival. For a son to desire his father's wife was not just a personal crisis, it was an existential one, a threat to the continuity of the dynasty, to the moral authority of kingship, to the entire system of succession. Erasistratus reported his diagnosis to Seleucus, and in what might be the most bafflingly composed reaction in royal history, Seleucus nodded. Then he gave up his wife. He didn't exile Antiochus. He didn't send Stratonice to a nunnery, or whatever the Greek equivalent might have been. He stepped aside, voluntarily. He handed over his young bride to his ailing son, declaring that love had cured the sickness, and that a peaceful transition of affection was a small price to pay for the future of the empire. This was not normal, not in any culture. Even in the context of Hellenistic realpolitik, where incest wasn't entirely taboo, where royal women were often pawns in political games, and where step relations were not necessarily protected by law, the move was radical. Seleucus's decision has been described by later historians as noble, paternal, even wise, but it also sets a disturbing precedent. If a king's wife can become a prince's bride, what happens to the concept of familial stability? If passion can overrule hierarchy, how long before a crown becomes just a piece of well-polished theatre? Of course, it's worth questioning how much of the story was real. Ancient sources, especially those relayed through Roman writers centuries later, tend to blur the line between biography and parable. Antiochus and Stratonice became symbols, the star-crossed lovers whose romance, endorsed by a king, proved that even dynasties could be reshaped by desire, or, depending on your perspective, corrupted by it. Antiochus went on to rule the Seleucid Empire after his father's death. His reign was mixed military campaigns against Galatian tribes, internal revolts, varying degrees of administrative stability. but the shadow of his marriage never quite left him. He was known as Soter, the savior, perhaps because he had once been saved by love, or perhaps because his father had saved the empire by stepping back. What makes the whole episode even more unsettling is how seamlessly it was integrated into court legend. No dramatic punishments, no divine retribution, no violent fallout. Just a smooth handoff. A symbolic shrug. In the modern retellings of ancient royal scandals, the Antiochus Stratinus story is often used as a kind of romantic anomaly. But what it really reveals is a deeper, more unnerving truth about dynastic politics. That family is not always a fixed structure. Sometimes it bends. Sometimes it contorts. Sometimes it gets passed down like a title. And the idea of marrying your father's wife, a concept that should on paper elicit horror, was instead rebranded as filial piety. Antiochus didn't steal Stratinus, he healed by loving her. Seleucus didn't lose a wife, he proved his virtue. Everyone wins until you look too closely. But if Antiochus's transgression was rationalized through love, the next royal on our list didn't bother with such romantic gloss. He simply did what he wanted and let the prophets deal with the consequences. He took his brother's wife, and the fallout would echo from Jerusalem to the banks of the Jordan. Herod Antipas. In the political world of first century Judea, there were no clean lines, only shifting alliances, bloodline betrayals, and marriages that looked suspiciously like power grabs. The Herodian dynasty was not so much a family as it was a web of overlapping ambitions held together by Roman approval and thinly veiled religious posturing. And Herod Antipas, one of Herod the Great's surviving sons, knew exactly how to play that game. He was never meant to rule the whole of Judea. After Herod the Great's death, Rome sliced the kingdom like a loaf of bread, handing different pieces to different sons. Antipas got Galilee and Perea, a politically volatile region with just enough prestige to feed an ego, but not enough to challenge Caesar. So he ruled as a tetrarch, not a king. A detail that would haunt him. He wanted the crown. He wanted legitimacy. But more than that, he wanted his brother's wife. Herodias was already married when Antipas met her. Married, inconveniently, to his half-brother Herod Philip. And not the obscure cousin kind of half-brother, this was a direct sibling from the Herodian mainline, son of the same father, product of the same dynasty-building machine. Herodias and Philip had a daughter Salome, and by all accounts, a politically safe union. Until Antipas intervened. What happened next wasn't framed as a scandal, it was framed as an arrangement. Antipas divorced his first wife, the daughter of a Nabatean king, a useful ally, and more on that later, and married Herodias. A marriage by Roman law? Maybe. By Jewish law? Absolutely not. She was his brother's wife. And Leviticus didn't stutter on that point. From the outside, it looked like yet another strategic alliance, two royal figures consolidating power, realigning inheritance rights, reshuffling court loyalties. But at the core of it was a violation, not of civil code, but of moral narrative. Antipas had married his sister-in-law. And in Judea, where Rome ruled the land but Scripture ruled the soul, that was more than just improper. It was prophetic kindling. Enter John the Baptist. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't even part of the formal priesthood. He was a wild-haired man in the desert, calling for repentance, wading through the Jordan, and doing the one thing that always gets you in trouble in a theocratic monarchy, telling the truth too loudly. John denounced the marriage publicly. "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." He said it plainly, repeatedly, and people listened. Because unlike Antipas, who needed Roman favor to maintain his rule, John didn't need anything. He had nothing to lose, which made him dangerous. Antipas, predictably, had him arrested. There was no trial, no dramatic theological debate, just a pragmatic silencing. Keep the preacher in prison and hope the crowds forget. Herodias, for her part, wanted more than silence. She wanted a final solution. Antipas wavered. He respected John, or perhaps feared him, but he also feared his new wife more. According to the Gospels, and again, we are walking a line here between religious text and political history. Herodias eventually got her wish. The method is debated, the motivations are muddled, but the core remains. John died in captivity, and Herod Antipas became the man who killed the voice crying in the wilderness, all for the sake of keeping his in-law marriage intact. The political cost was subtle at first. Antipas continued to rule, hosted Roman dignitaries, expanded his cities. He even founded Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, naming it in honor of Emperor Tiberius, as a kind of golden apple to curry favor with the powers in Rome. But remember that Nabatean princess he divorced to marry Herodias? Her name was Phasaelis, and her father was King Aretas IV, an Arabian ruler with enough military clout to make things uncomfortable when he felt insulted. Divorce, in this context, wasn't just a domestic squabble, it was a geopolitical provocation. And, when the time came, Aretas invaded. Antipas, stripped of alliances, lost the battle. Badly. And Rome, ever pragmatic, began to see him as more liability than leader. He would later be summoned to face Emperor Caligula under charges of treason and conspiracy. The crown he'd always wanted was denied him. He was exiled to Gaul, far from the desert palaces and political theatre of Judea. Herodias went with him, and thus the scandal ends not in flames, but in quiet erasure. The man who'd upended dynastic norms, provoked prophets, and tried to climb the royal ladder by marrying into it, faded into historical obscurity. No royal line followed him. No monuments bear his name. Just a footnote in gospel accounts, a lesson in what happens when political ambition and personal desire become indistinguishable. But the Herodian dysfunction didn't die with Antipas, because another brother, another heir, tried a similar trick. He also married a brother's widow, and his story was arguably worse. Because while Antipas lost a prophet, Herod Archelaus lost his entire throne. Herod Archelaus. If Herod Antipas was the brother who overreached and got exiled, Herod Archelaus was the one who underdelivered and got removed. As sons of Herod the Great, both men inherited fragments of a dynasty built on ruthless ambition, Roman patronage, and a willingness to bend religious law like a reed in the desert wind. But where Antipas tried to inflate his power by marrying his brother's wife, Archelaus made a similar move with a different flavor. He married his brother's widow. And in the tangle of Herodian politics, that wasn't just a scandal. It was a structural failure. To begin with, Herod Archelaus wasn't supposed to be the chosen one. His father, Herod the Great, had named and disinherited so many heirs over his chaotic life that the final version of his will read more like a corporate restructuring plan than a royal succession. Archelaus was ultimately awarded Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, a sizable chunk of his father's fractured kingdom, but not the title of king. He was designated as ethnarch, a word that sounded impressive but basically meant local manager, subject to Roman approval. And from day one, he struggled to hold the center. His reign, which lasted from 4 BCE to 6 CE, began with riots, complaints, and a formal petition to Caesar Augustus begging him to reconsider the appointment. The people of Judea didn't want Archelaus. They didn't trust him, and when he responded to unrest with mass executions at Passover, killing thousands in a city overflowing with pilgrims, he confirmed their worst fears. But underneath the brutality, there was another layer of instability. Family. Herod the Great's household had been a revolving door of wives, sons, and political marriages, and within that rotating cast, one name looms large: Alexander. A son of Herod the Great and the Hasmonean princess Mariamne, Alexander was once considered a likely heir. He was popular, well connected through his mother's lineage, and, in the end, executed by his own father on charges of treason. After Alexander's death, his widow Glaphyra, a Cappadocian princess, returned to her homeland. She was a politically valuable woman, well versed in royal life, and no stranger to the fine print of dynastic marriages. For a while, she remained out of Judean politics, and then, inexplicably, she returned and married Herod Archelaus. In other words, Archelaus married his executed brother's widow. This wasn't just awkward, it was illegal by the standards of Jewish law. Levitical texts prohibited a man from marrying his brother's wife unless the brother had died childless, in which case levirate marriage was required to continue the family line. But Alexander had children. The condition didn't apply. Archelaus therefore had no lawful or moral claim to Glaphyra, and worse, he knew it. So why do it? Historians suggest a mix of motivations. Glaphyra was politically valuable. Marrying her might have solidified Archelaus's position, especially among factions nostalgic for the Hasmonean dynasty. She also may have returned to Judea at the behest of Rome, or as part of a broader power play among Herod's surviving sons and their Roman handlers. And there is always the more human explanation: desire wrapped in ambition, the allure of reclaiming what belonged to a more favored brother. But the move backfired. The union was not celebrated. It was condemned. It didn't bring stability, it stoked further resentment. The people, already alienated by Archelaus's heavy-handed rule and erratic decisions, now had theological ammunition to add to their political grievances. He wasn't just a bad ethnarch, he was a transgressor, a breaker of divine law. And Rome noticed. By 6 CE, just a decade into his reign, Archelaus had amassed enough complaints that Caesar Augustus did what emperors usually avoid doing with client kings. He intervened. Archelaus was summoned to Rome, stripped of his position, and exiled to Gaul, far from the lands he failed to govern. Judea was downgraded from a semi-autonomous region to a Roman province, placed under the direct rule of imperial prefects. One of those prefects, years later, would be named Pontius Pilate. Thus ended the Herodian experiment in Judea. The line had fractured. The thrones were gone. And Archelaus, whose greatest political decision involved marrying a woman he had no right to, became a footnote to a failed dynasty. As for Glaphyra, her story vanishes into the mists of ancient record. Some sources claim she died shortly after marrying Archelaus, perhaps before the scandal could fully blossom. Others suggest she returned to Cappadocia, her name once again relegated to the margins of royal memory. But the implications linger. What does it mean when a brother claims his sibling's widow not for duty, but for convenience? What happens when the boundaries of kinship become tools in political survival, stretched until they lose all shape? Archelaus believed that power could excuse proximity, that political marriage could mask religious taboo, that if Rome approved, the people would tolerate. But what he learned, too late, is that even in the most cynical dynasties, the law of affinity can still bite. Not because of divine fire or priestly curses, but because it signals that a man who violates family structure might violate anything else. And he wasn't alone. Elsewhere in the ancient world, Kings weren't just marrying their in-laws, they were rewriting the entire definition of family, not through legal loopholes, but through open declarations. Even, in one royal case, by marrying a woman who had already been both his sister-in-law and his sister, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. In most families, marrying your sister-in-law raises eyebrows. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, it raised statues. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, the sibling-loving king of Hellenistic Egypt, did not merely bend the norms of dynastic marriage. He demolished them with ceremonial fanfare, built temples atop their ruins, and dared the gods to say something. Spoiler: they didn't. Or if they did, it was drowned out by a chorus of court poets, marble sculptors, and royal propagandists who were paid handsomely not to notice. Ptolemy II inherited a kingdom founded by one of Alexander the Great's most capable generals, Ptolemy I Soter, who had declared himself pharaoh after Alexander's death and carved out Egypt as his prize. By the time young Philadelphus took the throne in the early 3rd century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty was already known for its peculiar blend of Macedonian ambition and Egyptian divine kingship. But Ptolemy II would make that fusion fully operatic. To understand his most infamous marriage, we need to meet the woman at its center, Arsinoe II. She was his full sister, born of the same parents, and already a seasoned political survivor by the time their paths dramatically recrossed. Arsinoe had previously been married off to another powerful Hellenistic ruler, Lysimachus of Thrace. That marriage ended in typical ancient fashion with intrigue, war, and murder. After his death, she attempted to secure power for her sons in Macedon, briefly married her half-brother Ptolemy Keraunos, and then, wisely, fled after he had her children killed, as one does. By the time she returned to Egypt, she was a widowed queen, a dynastic chess piece, and the sister of a king who had both political problems and emotional voids to fill. So when Ptolemy II married Arsinoe II, it was many things at once: a political alliance, a spiritual gesture, a dynastic insurance policy, and of course, a scandal. Not because she was just his sister. That was already eyebrow-raising enough. But because before she was his sister-wife, she had been married to his half-brother. In other words, she was also his sister-in-law. In the tangled logic of Hellenistic royalty, this made perfect strategic sense. Dynasties were built on consolidation. The tighter the bloodline, the firmer the claim. Incest, especially among ruling families, was not considered a sin, it was considered an asset. The gods of Egypt had married their siblings for millennia. Isis and Osiris were role models. If divinity required inbreeding, then so be it. And so, Ptolemy did what few kings had the audacity to do. He married Arsinoe and declared it divine. Not in secret, not with hesitation. The marriage was public, theatrical, state-sanctioned. Coins were minted with their conjoined profiles. Statues of the royal couple were placed in temples. Hymns were written. The name Philadelphus was applied not as a slur, but as a badge of honor. Brother-loving, sibling-loving, Philadelphus. But here's the twist. The marriage also retroactively sanctified Arsinoe's previous status as sister-in-law. That relationship, already politically complex due to her union with Ptolemy Keraunos, was now absorbed and rewritten as part of a new dynastic myth. By elevating her to sister-wife, Ptolemy II didn't just legitimize their present connection, he erased her former ones. She was no longer the widow of a rival prince. She was the embodiment of dynastic purity, the female half of a sacred double. Of course, this came at a cost. The marriage between Ptolemy and Arsinoe scandalized the broader Hellenistic world. While Egyptian custom allowed, even encouraged, Sibling unions among deities and kings. The Greek-speaking elite, especially those outside Egypt, found it deeply unnatural. Sibling marriage was not just frowned upon in most of the Hellenic world, it was considered a violation of natural order. But Ptolemy didn't care, or more accurately, he stopped pretending to. He understood something many rulers came to learn, that scandal, when performed with enough confidence and backed by enough gold leaf, stops being scandal and starts becoming theology. The real power of the Ptolemaic marriage model wasn't just in its shock value, it was in how completely it absorbed contradiction. Ptolemy and Arsinoe weren't merely violating the norms of Greek society, they were replacing them with something else. Something shinier, something divine. The line between in-law and sibling disappeared not because anyone explained it away, but because no one was allowed to mention it at all. In later generations, the Ptolemies would take this model and run with it. Sister wives became the norm. A final boundaries, those invisible moral lines that separate your brother's wife from your own, were discarded like old furniture. The dynasty became a self-looping chain of in-laws turned spouses, cousins turned consorts. Bloodlines so knotted that historians often need charts just to keep track of who's related to whom and how many times. And at the very center of that tangled family tree stands Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, the couple that made in-law marriage not just acceptable, but sacred. Yet, even in this over-the-top royal pantomime, they were not the only rulers to marry into the same family twice. Far from it. In another part of the world, a Khmer king would also bind himself to a pair of sisters, first by love, then by strategy. And in doing so, he'd demonstrate that sometimes the best way to rule a kingdom is to marry both ends of the same family line. Jayavarman VII. In the stone heart of Southeast Asia, deep within the forests of what is now Cambodia, the Khmer Empire rose like a myth made visible. Towering temples pierced the jungle canopy. Roads fanned out in geometric perfection. Reservoirs so vast they mimicked lakes shimmered with engineering ambition. This was the world Jayavarman VII inherited, a kingdom scarred by war, swollen with divine expectation, and balanced uneasily between Hindu cosmology and royal pragmatism. And when he ascended the throne in the late 12th century, Jayavarman VII did what powerful kings so often do. He ruled by marrying wisely, but not just once. He married two sisters. Their names, Jayaraja Devi and Indra Devi, may not ring out across world history like Cleopatra or Catherine of Aragon, but in the context of Khmer political theology, they were dynastic linchpins. Jayaraja Devi was the first wife, a learned and devout woman, likely from a noble or possibly royal bloodline. She was more than a consort, she was a cultural collaborator, a religious benefactor, a visible presence in the public religious life of the empire. Together, she and Jayavarman shaped a court steeped in Mahayana Buddhism, a shift from the earlier Shaivite Hindu traditions that had defined Khmer royalty. The move wasn't merely spiritual, it was political. Buddhism offered a softer face of kingship, a more accessible model of leadership centered on compassion rather than divine wrath, and Jayavarman needed that image. His early reign was forged in fire rebellions, the reconquest of Angkor, and the need to unify a deeply fractured realm. But then Jayaraja Devi died, or perhaps retreated into religious life. The sources are hazy, as they often are when written on crumbling stone, but what's clear is this: Jayavarman did not remarry into another clan. He didn't look for a fresh alliance, a foreign queen, or a rival faction to placate. He married Indra Devi, his first wife's sister. It was not an uncommon practice in dynastic terms. In-law marriages kept alliances within the family, preserved loyalty, and minimized the risks of importing political rivals into the royal household. But in Jayavarman's case, it was also a deliberate continuation of his religious and ideological project. Indra Devi, like her sister, was highly educated. In fact, she was likely even more politically involved. She is credited with commissioning inscriptions, sponsoring temple constructions, and writing dedications that praised her husband as the embodiment of the bodhisattva ideal, a ruler who renounces personal gain for the salvation of others. Whether she believed this, or merely understood how useful it was to say so, is beside the point. She knew how to shape the narrative. The marriage between Jayavarman and Indra Devi was less about romance than it was about rhetorical continuity. By marrying his sister-in-law, Jayavarman not only preserved the ideological momentum begun with Jayarajadevi, he amplified it. The union provided stability in a court still healing from decades of warfare. It cemented the legitimacy of his Buddhist turn, allowing the royal family to appear as a seamless unit devoted to the Dharma. And it sent a message. The king does not look elsewhere. He finds everything. He needs wisdom, lineage, legitimacy within the same house. Literally. There's something eerily efficient about it. No new dowries, no external family trees to manage, no disruption of courtly factions. Just one dynasty folding inward, preserving its power through repetition. But even this seemingly harmonious arrangement isn't free of moral tension. In-law relationships, in almost every religious and cultural tradition, carry a residual aura of boundaries. A wife's sister may not be your sister, but she is still someone you are not supposed to view as a replacement. The grief to marriage pipeline is often softened by ritual, but never fully purified. It asks the court to accept that affection and duty are transferable commodities, that you can love the family, if not the individual. In this way, Jayavarman's decision echoes countless other royal maneuvers across the globe. The use of marriage not as a personal vow, but as a tool of continuity. The second sister stands in for the first. The lineage flows uninterrupted. The temples rise, the inscriptions sing, and no one asks too many questions. And yet, the Khmer model had its own unique twist. These weren't passive queens or shadowy figures behind veils. Jayarajadevi and Indradevi were intellectually active, publicly visible, and central to the court's self-image. They weren't just wives, they were theological co-authors. Their sisterhood wasn't a footnote, it was a cornerstone. Which leads us to wonder, was this about affection or branding? Did Jayavarman genuinely see in Indradevi a continuation of his bond with her sister? Or did he see a convenient substitute, a mirror with the same frame? The stone inscriptions don't say. But their silence is its own kind of answer. Because what matters in dynastic memory is not who loved whom, but who ruled, who built, and who was written into eternity alongside the king. And Jayavarman wasn't the only ruler to take sisters into his bed and his crown. Far to the west, another monarch equally divine, in theory equally calculating in practice, would take not just one sister-in-law, but a collection. A royal household composed of siblings, overlapping titles, and a family tree that curled in on itself like a lotus vine. In Siam, the throne didn't just tolerate in-law unions, it institutionalized them. King Chulalongkorn of Siam. In the rarefied corridors of 19th century Siam, where golden palanquins glided past whitewashed temples and royal etiquette governed the angle of every bow, monarchy was not just a form of government, it was cosmology. To rule was to radiate divine order. The Chakri dynasty of Thailand, then called Siam, did not merely sit atop society, it sat at the axis of heaven and earth. And within this celestial bureaucracy, No detail was accidental, not policy, not poetry, and certainly not marriage. So when King Chulalongkorn, also known as Rama V, took not one, but several of his half-sisters as wives, it wasn't framed as a breach of decorum. It was framed as preservation. Born in 1853, Chulalongkorn was the son of King Mongkut Rama IV, whose reign was immortalized in the West through The King and I, a musical full of liberties, colonial fantasies, and deeply inaccurate waltzes. But Chulalongkorn, unlike the caricature drawn of his father, was a reformer in the modern sense. He abolished corvée labor, modernized the legal code, restructured the military, and resisted European colonization with a mixture of diplomacy, charm, and administrative brilliance. And yet, for all his progressive leanings, he preserved one ancient institution with remarkable commitment: the practice of marrying within the royal family. His queen consorts included not just noblewomen of high birth, but several of his own half-sisters, women who were also the daughters of King Mongkut, but by different mothers. Among them were Queen Savang Vadana and Queen Sauvaba Fongsri. These weren't distant cousins or symbolic unions. They were living, breathing sister wives, and in the eyes of the court, they were ideal. Why? Because royal blood was not something to be diluted. In the Siamese court, as in many monarchies, legitimacy was not just about descent, it was about concentration. The Chakri dynasty, still relatively young by Asian dynastic standards, needed to reinforce its divine mandate. By marrying his half-sisters, Chulalongkorn kept the bloodline pure, the power contained, and the legitimacy unchallenged. It wasn't a secret, it was protocol. The Grand Palace functioned less like a home and more like a highly stratified social engine. Dozens of consorts lived within its walls, organized by rank, lineage, and proximity to the king. Some were wives in name only. Others bore children, founded court factions, and oversaw elaborate household rituals. The role of queen was not simply romantic, it was institutional. A crown required a system, and the system required insiders. Marrying sisters-in-law, or more accurately, elevating sisters to the dual role of wife and in-law, was a way of ensuring that system never fractured. The relationships were stacked like lacquer boxes, each layer reinforcing the next. If your queen was also your sister, then your in-laws were your own blood. There could be no foreign influence, no rival clan pulling at the seams. But this familial loop created its own contradictions. Chulalongkorn's reign was marked by attempts to modernize Siam along European lines. He sent princes abroad to study in Europe, built railways, introduced civil service exams, and reshaped the court to resemble a constitutional monarchy, at least in its external posture. Yet behind the marble facades and imported typewriters, the king was maintaining a family structure that would have scandalized the West. The same European powers he sought to impress would have found his domestic arrangements difficult to explain at embassy dinners. But Chulalongkorn didn't bend to Victorian morality. He simply edited the narrative. In public, his queens were paragons of virtue, depicted in portraits wearing European gowns and serene expressions. In private, the court operated under older rules. Queens who were sisters were placed in carefully ranked positions. Their sons, princes by birth, nephews by blood, were groomed for leadership, their maternal lineages mapping neatly onto the same paternal trunk. The family tree didn't branch, it folded inward. This strategy had its risks. Concentrating power within a single genetic pool, however symbolically divine, often leads to complications, political and otherwise, and yet, in the short term, it worked. Chulalongkorn's reign was one of stability, expansion, and preservation. He avoided colonization where others succumbed, kept Siam sovereign, and left behind a legacy still venerated today. And in that legacy, his sister queens are often remembered less as individuals than as role slots filled in the grand design of a sacred monarchy. Their sisterhood wasn't incidental, it was structural. They were wives, mothers, and symbols, all at once, and their intimacy, codified by rank and ritual, blurred the very concept of in-law into something unrecognizable to the outside world, but not unrecognizable to other dynasties. Because while Siam dressed its sister-in-law unions in silken silence halfway across Asia, another royal court would make a similar move, equally strategic, equally poetic. In imperial China, a Han emperor would elevate two sisters into his private orbit, one as empress, the other as consort, and in doing so, he would turn familial proximity into palace theatre. Emperor Cheng of Han. In the gold-draped silence of the Western Han court, where etiquette was ritualized to the syllable and even sorrow wore ceremonial robes, the emperor was less a man than a shadow moving behind lacquered screens. To rule China in the 1st century BCE was to be cloaked in divine ambiguity. One must weep on command, rage with moderation, and marry wisely, though never, it seems, without consequence. Emperor Cheng of Han was not an imposing figure. He reigned from 33 BCE to 7 BCE, a period marked less by triumph than by slow decay. His court was swollen with intrigue, his family line dangerously thin, and his reputation then and now decidedly unimpressive. He was a ruler burdened by infertility and drowned in ceremony. But his private decisions, like so many emperors before and after him, carried public consequences, especially when those decisions involved sisters. The tale of Emperor Cheng and the Zhao sisters Feiyan and Hede is one of those stories that reads like fiction but lies buried in the folds of historical record, passed down in stylized brushstrokes on bamboo slips and court annals. Together, the Zhao sisters would come to define his reign, one as empress, the other as imperial consort. One as the face of the dynasty, the other as the hand behind the veil. And both, technically, as sisters-in-law. Zhao Feiyan, the elder of the two, entered the palace not by bloodline, but by performance. She was a dancer renowned for grace, famous for a physique so delicate she was said to weigh little more than a swallow. Hence her name, Feiyan, flying swallow. Selected from among the entertainers to enter the imperial harem, she rose with improbable speed. Within a few years, she replaced the reigning empress and was installed as Empress Zhao, a commoner transformed into the empire's highest-ranking woman. Her younger sister, Zhao Hede, followed closely behind. Introduced into the palace shortly after her sister's elevation, she too became a favored consort of the emperor. Together, the Zhao sisters commanded not just affection, but influence, controlling access to the emperor, whispering into the ears of ministers, and orchestrating court rivalries with an elegance that belied their humble origins. Their dual presence in the palace was an open secret, while officially, only Feiyan wore the empress's jade pendant. Hede's favor with the emperor rivaled and at times surpassed her sister's. Court records, filled with veiled language and metaphoric turns, hint at a balance of power that was both shared and contested. The sisters moved as a unit, yet each carved her own path. They were rivals, allies, and political actors sometimes all at once. To marry one woman and then elevate her sister to near equal status was not simply a personal indulgence. In Confucian terms, it was a disruption of hierarchy. The imperial court was supposed to reflect cosmic order, heaven above, earth below, ruler and ruled, husband and wife. But here were two sisters, both occupying the inner chambers of the Son of Heaven, both blurring the line between empress and consort, family and state. And yet, it wasn't without precedent. Imperial China had long tolerated, if not openly endorsed, strategic marriages within families. Final relationships, especially those involving sisters, were occasionally encouraged to maintain harmony within the harem. If a ruler loved one woman, bringing in her sister was seen as a way to preserve loyalty, reduce factionalism, and stabilize the domestic sphere. In theory. In practice, it rarely worked out that cleanly. The Zhao sisters accumulated enemies. High-born families resented their commoner roots. Scholars criticized their grip on the emperor. And the one problem they could not solve, the emperor's failure to produce a legitimate heir, became the stone around their necks. Whispered accusations of sorcery, seduction, and worse began to circulate. Childlessness in the imperial line was not just a personal tragedy, it was a national emergency, and someone had to be blamed. Eventually, the web collapsed. Zhao Feiyan, stripped of her title after Chang's death, would die in obscurity. Zhao Hede, implicated in court intrigues, vanished from records under a cloud of suspicion. Their reign over the inner court, once graceful and golden, ended not with execution or exile, but with the careful, deliberate forgetting that imperial history so often reserved for inconvenient women. But their story remains a case study in how sibling relationships could be leveraged in the pursuit of power. Emperor Cheng didn't simply fall for two women, he strategically merged his affections into a single familial alliance. What he gained in loyalty and control, he lost in legitimacy and legacy. The Han line faltered, succession crises erupted, and the dynasty, so focused on maintaining appearances, quietly erased the sisters whose beauty had once lit up its throne room. Still, one pattern had been set. Sisters as consorts, sisters-in-law, turned into shadows of queens. This would not be the last time an emperor rearranged the furniture of family for the sake of convenience. And as we drift further into the labyrinth of dynastic marriages, we find another ruler of the Han, a man who took the sister of an empress dowager as his own, creating a second-generation echo of the same tangled web. Emperor Huan of Han. By the time Emperor Huan rose to power in 146 CE, the Han dynasty was already beginning to wobble. Not collapse, not yet, but tremble slightly under the weight of its own contradictions. On paper, it was still the mighty Han, master of the Silk Road, heir to the mandate of heaven, center of the world. In practice, it was a palace filled with eunuch factions, dowager queens with suspiciously long influence, and emperors like Huan, young, pliable, and surrounded by people who claimed to serve heaven but mostly served themselves. He was 14 when he took the throne, a boy king, elevated not by divine favor or popular acclaim, but by court consensus, an emperor chosen for his malleability. What followed was a reign marked not by great conquests or legendary reforms, but by quiet corrosion, corruption, scandal, internal decay. Yet amid all the bureaucratic rot and ritual pageantry, Emperor Huan made one choice that perfectly captures the dynastic logic of a final politics. He married his aunt-in-law's sister, and in doing so, he cemented a royal pattern, one that prioritized the concentration of power over the clarity of kinship. Let's unravel that slowly. The Empress Dowager at the time was Liang Na, a woman of intense political weight. As the widow of Emperor Shun and regent for her adoptive son, she had wielded the throne's authority long before Huan ever appeared in the annals. Liang Na belonged to the formidable Liang clan, a family that had mastered the art of controlling emperors from the side through the empress's seat rather than the throne itself. And like many dynasties before and after, the Han court had learned that the fastest way to control the Son of Heaven was to place him in bed with your sister. So Emperor Huan married Liang Nuying, Liang Na's younger sister, his aunt-in-law's sister, technically. But titles start to lose meaning when bloodlines loop into themselves. The union was political from the beginning. Liang Nuying wasn't chosen for beauty or affection, though both were claimed in court poetry, but for strategic consolidation. By marrying into the Liang family, Emperor Huan appeared to be honoring the dominant clan of the court. In return, the Liangs gained yet another point of access to the emperor's inner circle. It was not just about affection, it was access management, dynasty edition. But things soured quickly. Liang Nuying, once empress, turned out to be a formidable figure, vain, ambitious, and deeply insecure. Court historians, never fans of powerful women unless they were long dead, wrote of her jealousy and vindictiveness. Most damningly, they recorded that she prevented Emperor Huan from producing an heir with other consorts. This accusation, whether true or not, became a staple of posthumous character assassination. A barren empress was tolerable, a jealous one was not. And the emperor? He chafed under the Liang thumb. He resented their grip on court appointments, their arrogance, their presumption, but for years he did nothing. Because the Liang clan was too entrenched, too connected, too dangerous. Until one day, they weren't. In 159 CE, Liang Na died, and Emperor Huan, now in his late 20s, finally acted. He allied with a group of powerful eunuchs, yes, the same eunuchs often blamed for ruining the dynasty, and orchestrated a swift, brutal purge of the Liang family. Ministers were arrested, generals executed. Liang Nuying, the empress he had once married to preserve court harmony, was stripped of power and died shortly afterward, perhaps by illness, perhaps by despair. The historical records are pointedly vague. And what remained? The legacy of another in-law marriage gone sour. The idea that an emperor, in trying to stabilize his throne by marrying into a powerful family, had only shackled himself further. By wedding the sister of an empress dowager, Emperor Huan had effectively married into a faction. And factions, unlike wives, don't die quietly. This wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The Han dynasty had come to rely on the same few families to provide empresses, regents, and caretakers of the crown. The result was a closed loop of power, recycled bloodlines, shared bedrooms, and a perpetual dance of a final chess moves. By marrying Liang Nuying, Huan wasn't just gaining a wife, he was submitting to a political apparatus disguised as a family. And perhaps that was the point. Final relationships in the Han court were never just about love or lust. They were about risk management. They were about making sure the emperor stayed in line, surrounded by people whose loyalty could be presumed, because it had been manufactured by marriage. But the system had its limits. After the Liang purge, Emperor Huan didn't become a stronger ruler, he became a lonelier one. The eunuchs he had empowered soon filled the vacuum left by the Liangs, leading to even greater abuses of power. The court descended further into factionalism. The imperial family, so obsessed with marrying its own in-laws to preserve order, had merely succeeded in tightening its own noose. Still, the logic endured, because if one sister could anchor a royal ideology, two could define it. In another corner of the ancient world, on the sun-drenched shores of the Pacific, one king wouldn't just marry a politically convenient woman, he'd marry her sisters too, all of them. as if building an entire dynasty from a single household. Kamehameha. Aye. In the islands of Hawaii, long before the arrival of European ships with their polished cannons and missionary grammar, there was a system, not a monarchy in the European sense, and certainly not a democracy. It was a lineage-based hierarchy where bloodlines ran deeper than coral reefs and where political authority was measured not only by genealogy but by mana, spiritual power inherited, accumulated, and sometimes violently contested. At the top of this system stood the Alii Nui, the High Chiefs, whose marriages weren't just domestic choices, they were cosmic alignments. To marry well was to consolidate mana. To marry strategically was to control the archipelago. And no one understood this better than Kamehameha I. The man who would unify the Hawaiian Islands under a single rule was not simply a warrior, nor merely a strategist. He was also, in every sense, a royal architect. He built his dynasty the way others built canoes, carefully, with attention to materials, balance, and above all, connection. And his most enduring structural decision? He married 3 sisters. Their names were Ka'ahumanu, Kalakua, Kahehaimali, and Namahana Pi'ia, each from a noble line. Each connected not only to Kamehameha's ambitions but to one another in a web of mutual loyalty, family prestige, and political convenience. They were more than wives. They were part of a system designed to concentrate power into a single lineage to make the family tree look more like a wreath. To modernize, this may seem odd, perhaps even taboo. But in the context of ancient Hawaiian society, where class, birth order, and ancestral rank dictated nearly every aspect of life, such a marriage arrangement was neither unusual nor illicit. In fact, it was ideal. Marriage among high-ranking siblings or close relatives was not just permitted, it was encouraged among the Ali'i Kapua, the sacred chiefs. The aim was not love, but purity. Dynastic purity, spiritual potency. To dilute the royal line with an outsider's blood would be to weaken it. To marry within was to preserve and amplify one's sacred authority. Ka'ahumanu, the most well-known of the 3 sisters, was not simply a favorite consort. She was the political mind behind the throne. Fierce, intelligent, and uncompromising, she would later become Kuhina Nui, a sort of co-regent or prime minister after Kamehameha's death. Her authority was so complete that missionaries would later refer to her as the female Kamehameha. But her rise to power wasn't just a matter of personal charisma. It was built on the tight familial web that Kamehameha had so meticulously constructed. Her sister Kalakua Kahehaimali also became one of Kamehameha's wives, bearing him several children, including Kamamalu, who would later marry Kamehameha II. Meanwhile, Namahana Pi'ia, the eldest, brought with her noble lineage from Maui, strategically important in a time when uniting the islands was still more aspiration than policy. These were not secondary marriages. These were alliances both vertical and horizontal. Kamehameha wasn't just marrying into families, he was marrying across them, braiding the noblest bloodlines into a single, unbreakable rope. And because the sisters were related to one another, the alliances were self-reinforcing. Their loyalty to Kamehameha was matched by loyalty to each other, creating a closed circuit of dynastic power that spanned Oahu, Maui, and the Big Island. This model worked because Hawaiian political theology made room for it. The kapu system, the intricate code of sacred prohibitions and privileges, classified people not by individual merit but by inherited status. Some individuals were kapu moi, meaning that others had to prostrate themselves in their presence. These rankings weren't disrupted by sibling marriage, they were supported by it. But the system came with costs. Kamehameha's dynasty, built on the internal logic of ali'i marriages, would face challenges the moment external powers arrived. The missionaries who came from New England found the polygamous structure scandalous. They brought with them strict Christian doctrines about monogamy, gender roles, and family structure doctrines that collided head-on with Hawaiian royal customs. After Kamehameha's death, Kaahumanu would, ironically, be the one to oversee a cultural pivot. She converted to Christianity, embraced some aspects of Western governance, and even banned traditional Hawaiian religion in what became known as the Ainoa, the free eating, a symbolic breaking of the kapu between men and women. But before that transformation, she had been part of a royal sisterhood, an internal alliance of in-laws, wives, and political collaborators. What Kamehameha understood, what he demonstrated with meticulous clarity, is that family could be engineered, not simply inherited, but designed. Sisters could be wives, wives could be ministers, and the boundaries between public rule and private connection could be dissolved entirely, as long as the power remained intact. And while the triple sister marriage may seem like an outlier, it was in fact part of a recurring pattern, monarchs across the globe shaping their households like they shaped their borders. Sometimes for love, sometimes for lust, but more often for power. And in one ancient kingdom, this same principle, marrying a father's wife or a brother's widow, became more than royal tradition. It became mythology, a story retold so often that it blurred the lines between history and symbol, and transformed one in-law union into the very emblem of dynastic ambition. Seleucus's dynasty encore, the Stratonus transfer retold. History, when viewed from a safe distance, tends to flatten. Emperors become bullet points, scandals become trivia. But some stories survive the crushing weight of time, not because they were the most important, but because they were the most unsettlingly poetic. The Seleucid tale of Stratonus, recycled across generations and reinterpreted as legend, is one of those rare moments where politics, family, and myth collapse into a single gesture. A king giving his wife to his son. We've already met this story once, Antiochus I, burning with forbidden affection for his stepmother Stratonus, a flame so debilitating it masqueraded as terminal illness. Seleucus, I Nicator, his father and king, recognizing the symptoms not as a doctor might, but as a politician must. The diagnosis, love. The prescription, marriage. The son gets the woman. The father steps aside. The dynasty is preserved, even if the logic isn't. It was an unsettling story, even in its own time. And yet, that didn't stop it from becoming a kind of courtly archetype, a recurring motif in ancient literature. A tale so stylized that it slid easily from political reality into artistic metaphor. In Greek and Roman plays, the Stratonicean triangle became a stock narrative: aged king, young heir, beautiful woman, caught in between. It was used as a dramatic shorthand for dynastic compromise and generational transfer. But under the costume jewelry and choral monologues, the core remained unchanged. A woman once called mother, now held in a lover's embrace, and all of it sanctioned by law, ritual, and royal decree. By the time Roman authors got hold of it, the story had mutated. The emotional agony of Antiochus was embellished. His illness became a metaphor for political stagnation, a literal lovesickness that threatened the future of the empire. His physician, Erasistratus, transformed from court doctor to sage-like counselor, a wise figure who could read the pulse not just of the boy, but of the kingdom itself. The diagnosis wasn't just about unspoken desire, it was about the fragility of dynastic continuity. And Seleucus? He evolved into the model of enlightened self-sacrifice, the father who yielded not out of weakness, but out of vision, the king who understood that sometimes, to preserve power, one must surrender possession. But of course, that's the sanitized version, the comfortable one. Because if we look at the actual implications, what we're left with is a disturbing philosophical proposition that in the world of dynasties, relationships are always negotiable. Not just alliances and treaties, but marriages, mothers, and moral categories. What matters isn't whether something feels wrong, it's whether it can be made to function. Stratinus, in most retellings, has no recorded opinion. Her inner life is absent from the scrolls. Was she in love with Antiochus? Indifferent? Trapped? It's unclear, and perhaps deliberately so. Ancient sources were never terribly interested in the agency of royal women, especially when those women became symbolic scaffolding for larger ideas, succession, duty, sacrifice. What matters is not what she wanted, but what her role accomplished. Continuity. Her marriage to Antiochus stabilized the transition of power, confirmed the legitimacy of the heir, and allowed Seleucus to maintain influence from the wings. It was a political move wrapped in the language of parental compassion. And perhaps that's why the story was told and retold, because it offered a way to talk about uncomfortable truths without naming them. It became a parable of power, how desire, dynasty, and decorum can all coexist, as long as no one asks too many questions, as long as love can be reframed as duty and transgression as sacrifice. The Roman biographer Plutarch admired the story enough to preserve it. Renaissance painters reimagined it in silk and oil. Even 18th century playwrights revived the tale, casting Stratinus as a tragic heroine caught in a moral paradox, and Antiochus as the symbol of pure, helpless passion. Over time, the political sharpness dulled. The scandals softened into fable. The discomfort became decor. And yet, every retelling still hinges on the same impossible logic, that a father could hand his wife to his son and call it virtue. It's tempting to dismiss the tale as an outlier, a weird quirk of Hellenistic succession politics, but the persistence of the motif suggests otherwise. It endured not because it was aberrant, but because it was useful. Because it gave voice to a deeper truth about royal families across civilizations, that the boundaries of kinship are always at risk of being redrawn when power is at stake. And it wasn't just the Seleucids. The story of in-law marriage, of stepping into a sibling's or parent's romantic shoes, became a kind of quiet strategy across empires. Especially in Judea, where the Herodian dynasty turned these boundary-blurring unions into something even more routine, a normalized, multi-generational pattern, not mythology, not metaphor. Policy. Herodian tangle, the broader, brother's wife pattern. The Herodian dynasty, an uneasy hybrid of Jewish heritage and Roman authority, was never particularly known for its moral clarity. Its founding patriarch, Herod the Great, was a client king who owed his throne to Caesar Augustus and held it with a grip equal parts iron and trembling. He built cities, murdered relatives, renovated the temple in Jerusalem, and lived long enough to see his family become not just infamous, but structurally unsustainable. If other dynasties flirted with marrying in-laws as an occasional scandal or strategic accident, the Herodians turned it into something close to doctrine. For them, affinity wasn't a boundary, it was a ladder, and they climbed it without hesitation. Marrying a brother's widow, taking a niece as a wife, recycling spouses between uncles and nephews. The family tree of the Herodians reads less like a genealogy and more like a Mobius strip looping, folding, turning back on itself in a dizzying effort to concentrate power within a single bloodline and keep external alliances at arm's length. At the heart of this tangle lies a pragmatic philosophy. Keep it in the family, literally. To understand how common these in-law unions were, one only needs to look at the family of Herod the Great and trace the pattern that runs like a scar through multiple generations. Herod's sons, Aristobulus IV, Alexander, Antipas, Archelaus, and Philip, didn't just inherit portions of his kingdom after his death in 4 BCE. They also inherited his political sensibilities, and with them, the unspoken rule that royal marriages were not about compatibility, they were about consolidation. We've already examined Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus, 2 sons who infamously took their brothers' wives, one scandalizing religious prophets and the other drawing the ire of Rome itself. But they were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a deeper, a final philosophy. Take, for example, Herod Philip, who married Herodias, a granddaughter of Herod the Great. This made her Philip's niece. Not especially unusual in the Herodian context, niece marriage was borderline expected at the upper echelons of this family. But when Herodias later left Philip and married his half-brother Antipas, it created a cascade of complications, political, legal, and theological. It also triggered the ire of John the Baptist, who became the mouthpiece for a wider discontent about the dynasty's flagrant disregard for traditional norms. Or consider Salome, the daughter of Herodias and Philip. She later married her great-uncle Philip the Tetrarch, another son of Herod the Great, and thus her mother's uncle, which made him, also, her great-uncle by blood, and her stepfather by marriage, and her cousin-in-law, depending on how you trace the overlaps. This wasn't a family that married strategically once or twice to shore up influence. This was a dynasty that created policy out of marrying in-laws and close kin. The goal was not discretion, it was dominance. The Herodians married within their ranks to keep property and political control tightly looped. Every marriage was a brick in a palace wall designed not for love, but for fortification. And yet, the social cost was real. These unions might have made political sense within the insular logic of the Herodian court, but they set the dynasty increasingly at odds with the broader Jewish population, who viewed such marriages through the lens of Torah law. The Levitical prohibitions against uncovering a brother's nakedness or marrying a brother's wife, niece, or stepdaughter weren't just religious suggestions. They were foundational codes. Violating them wasn't a matter of poor optics, it was seen as outright defilement. And the Herodians violated them with mechanical precision. Religious authorities and lay people alike viewed the dynasty as morally compromised, even if they couldn't challenge its power directly. The tension between Herodian behavior and Jewish expectation widened into a dangerous fault line, one that would eventually contribute to widespread unrest, revolt, and Rome's tightening grip on the region. But the Herodians never saw the problem. From their perspective, these unions weren't transgressive, they were practical. In-law relationships were predictable. They created alliances with people already vetted, already invested in the dynasty's future, already within reach of the palace doors. And for a family constantly under pressure internally from rival claimants, externally from Roman overseers, trust mattered more than taboo. Ironically, this internal logic mirrored other dynasties across history. The Herodians weren't inventing a new pattern, they were simply deploying it more aggressively. The Ptolemies had done it. The Seleucids had set the literary standard. Even the Tang emperors would later take daughters-in-law into their private quarters. But the Herodians stand out because their version of in-law marriage was so repetitive, so structural, and so brazenly unrepentant. And that's the moral discomfort buried beneath the footnotes. The line between a one-time scandal and a normalized system isn't legal, it's frequency. One brother marrying another's wife? That's newsworthy. A whole dynasty doing it generation after generation? That's a governance model. Still, even within this tangle of strategic in-law entanglements, one figure stood out not for what he did, but for what he almost did. His name, again, was Henry VIII. And he had already taken one sister. But the power play that followed suggests he may have also turned his eye toward another Boleyn woman, not the one he married, but the one who held the most influence in the background. Their mother, Henry VIII, the prospective mother-in-law power play. By the time Henry VIII set his sights on Anne Boleyn, he had already rewritten the laws of God, country, and marital logic. He had dissolved his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon through a painfully public theological debate. He had fractured Christendom, weaponized Leviticus, and forged the Church of England, all for the sake of producing a male heir and, not incidentally, possessing a woman who refused to be possessed. But behind the royal drama of Henry and Anne, behind the sonnets, the annulments, and the executions, there's a lesser-known thread, a whisper that refuses to go away. It wasn't just Anne, and it wasn't just Mary. There was another Boleyn, older, wiser, married, and far too close to the throne for comfort. Her name was Elizabeth Howard Boleyn, mother to both Anne and Mary. And while there is no conclusive evidence that Henry ever pursued her as a lover, the proximity, the political choreography, and the structure of the Boleyn household created a cloud of implications so dense it practically needed a herald to cut through it. At the very least, Elizabeth Boleyn was a silent witness to an entire royal court slowly collapsing into moral ambiguity. At most, she may have been a participant in ways history dared not confirm. Let's unpack the logic, not of what happened, but what almost did. Henry had, according to credible sources, already carried on an affair with Mary Boleyn, Elizabeth's elder daughter. This wasn't idle gossip. Even the Pope had reason to believe it. The affair was common knowledge at court, acknowledged in foreign correspondence, and widely accepted by historians, even if the exact dates remain murky. Mary was married off in haste to William Carey, likely as a face-saving maneuver, and faded conveniently into the background. But the damage was done. Under canon law, once you've slept with a woman, her sister is off limits. Affinity, as the Church called it, is a concept both technical and emotional. It assumes that intimacy, even a final, marital, or non-consummated, creates permanent boundaries. Henry ignored those rules when he pursued Anne, Mary's sister, and the irony? The very same legal grounds that he would later invoke to divorce Catherine of Aragon, that she had been his brother's wife, also condemned his pursuit of Anne, because Anne was the sister of his former mistress. The web was closing in. But then there's Elizabeth, the mother of both. She wasn't just a passive matron. She was a daughter of the powerful Howard family, one of the most ambitious noble houses in England. Her brother, Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was a master of political triangulation, always several chess moves ahead. Elizabeth herself was no shrinking violet. She ran the Boleyn household, oversaw her daughter's courtly education, and, according to several foreign ambassadors, was deeply involved in managing their relationships with the king. This wasn't a family caught off guard by royal interest. This was a family positioning itself inside it. French diplomat Eustace Chapuis, never one to miss a scandal, hinted darkly that Henry's entanglement with the Boleyns extended throughout the household. Whether this was mere implication or a veiled accusation remains uncertain. But the structure of Henry's relationships with the Boleyn women invited speculation. Here was a king who had slept with one daughter, courted another, and spent time in the intimate orbit of the woman who raised them both, Proximity breeds narrative. And the scandal wasn't just who Henry did pursue, it was who he shouldn't have. From a canonical standpoint, if Henry had indeed been involved with both daughters, then any future marriage to either one, let alone any affection for the mother, violated the Church's law on consanguinity and affinity. The boundaries of kinship were already buckling under his decisions. The idea that he might have also desired Elizabeth or simply moved within the emotional realm of such desire was enough to render the entire Boleyn affair more grotesque than romantic, more dynastic fever dream than courtly love story. And what's especially unnerving is the way the Boleyn family seemed unbothered by these dynamics. They navigated the scandal with the deftness of courtiers who had done this before. Elizabeth Boleyn remained near Anne during her rise. She was present at Anne's coronation. She reportedly collapsed from stress during her daughter's imprisonment, but remained largely silent throughout the king's devastating reversals. Silence, in this context, wasn't passivity, it was preservation. Perhaps the most damning irony of all is this. Henry's obsession with Anne was built on a foundation of illicit proximity. He chased the younger sister of a former mistress and was surrounded by a mother who knew all too well how the game was played. He legislated his own moral absolution, even as the walls closed in. And what began as a love affair became a theological crisis, one that would unravel with a series of trials, beheadings, and illegitimate offspring. But the in-law entanglements didn't end with Anne, nor with Elizabeth. Because Henry's pattern wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He kept entangling himself in the same families, the same names, the same bloodlines. And one name in particular kept coming back, Louis XIV. He too had blurred the lines between family and desire. But in his case, the scandal with his sister-in-law wasn't buried in legal disputes or papal decrees. It was played out on the golden stage of Versailles. Louis XIV, Madame as diplomatic scandal. Versailles was not a palace, it was a performance. A curated reality of marble facades and candle-lit hierarchy, where every gesture, wardrobe change, and glance across the hall of mirrors was steeped in implication. Louis XIV, the self-declared Sun King, didn't simply live at Versailles. He was Versailles. He choreographed the state like a ballet, cast himself as its lead, and positioned his court like a living tableau. Nothing was accidental. So when he fell, perhaps slowly, perhaps all at once, for Henrietta of England, his sister-in-law, it wasn't just a personal failing. It was a geopolitical hazard wrapped in silk and family ties. Henrietta Anne of England, known in France as Madame, was not a woman easily overlooked. She was the daughter of a beheaded King Charles I of England and had spent her early years as a royal refugee in France. Her marriage to Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, Louis XIV's younger brother, was not born of love, but of diplomacy. The match was designed to bind England and France closer after the trauma of regicide and revolution. But instead of forging unity, it opened the door to something far more unstable: proximity. Henrietta was charming, intelligent, politically shrewd, and, as accounts suggest, lonely. Her husband, Philippe, was more interested in court fashions and his male favourites than in marital companionship. Their union was one of ceremonial obligation. Theirs was not a bedroom drama, it was a cold contract. And it left Henrietta adrift in a court of carefully concealed knives, trapped in the gilded cage of her title, yet utterly without intimacy. Enter Louis. The king and Madame shared long walks in the garden, private readings, late-night conversations behind tapestries. They were siblings in law by marriage, but in practice, something more ambiguous, familiar, affectionate, and increasingly inseparable. Contemporaries began to talk, and when Versailles whispers, the rest of Europe listens. The scandal wasn't in the affair itself. Versailles was practically engineered to tolerate extramarital liaisons. It was who she was. Sleeping with your brother's wife wasn't just bad optics, it was a theological and diplomatic minefield. France was still technically Catholic. Affinal relationships, those acquired by marriage, were regarded as morally binding. Your brother's wife, even if estranged, was still untouchable, biblically so. But Louis had never been constrained by doctrine when desire called. The idea that his status as king placed him above moral law wasn't subtext, it was policy. Divine right wasn't just a theory, it was a lived reality. And in that reality, Henrietta, his sister-in-law, was dangerously accessible. Their flirtation was conducted with the plausible deniability of high court life, always public enough to be noticed, never explicit enough to be proven. But behind the theatrical restraint was a real undercurrent. Henrietta was unhappy. Louis was unchallenged. The political world around them was volatile. The emotional environment was combustible. And then, as if to underscore just how tangled the web had become, Madame was tasked with diplomacy. In 1670, she travelled to England to help finalise the Treaty of Dover, a secret alliance between Louis XIV and her brother, Charles II of England. The treaty promised French support for English Catholic interests and included clauses that would shape European politics for decades. Henrietta wasn't just a messenger, she was the symbol of the Franco-English bond. She negotiated, charmed, translated. She was the living embodiment of everything Versailles wanted Europe to believe about its royal family. Poised, refined, strategic. And then, weeks later, she died. The official cause, peritonitis, following the consumption of cold water after exercise. But Versailles, true to form, never accepts a tidy death. Rumours bloomed like mould beneath brocade. Some blamed poison, others pointed fingers at her husband's inner circle. A few even whispered that her death was an act of mercy, a way of quietly eliminating a diplomatic liability too emotionally entangled with the king. Louis, for his part, staged a mourning performance worthy of myth. He ordered tributes, issued statements, rewrote her memory in the language of lost virtue. But the court knew what it had seen. A sister-in-law too close, a king too invested, a scandal too dangerous to name. And just like that, Henrietta Madame was erased from Versailles with the same elegance with which she had once enchanted it. Her rooms were reassigned, her portrait subtly moved, her name invoked only in hushed nostalgia. But the legacy remained. The Louis-Henrietta affair became the archetype of Versailles intimacy gone too far. It blurred the already fragile line between family and power, between marriage and monarchy, between statecraft and desire. And it left a vacuum. Because when one sister-in-law falls, another often rises. And the next story would come not from a palace of mirrors, but from a medieval kingdom in the Balkans where a Serbian king would quietly marry a woman whose only qualification was that she happened to be related to his brother's wife. Not quite incest, not quite scandal, but definitely not coincidence. King Milutin of Serbia, the brother's sister-in-law equation. In the flickering torchlight of the medieval Balkans, where kingdoms rose and fell as quickly as alliances were made, the Nemanjic dynasty of Serbia ruled with a blend of Byzantine orthodoxy and Balkan improvisation. It was a time when royal marriages were less about affection and more about arithmetic balancing power, land, and bloodlines with a kind of cold, strategic logic. And if the sums didn't quite add up to moral clarity, well, that was the cost of rule. King Milutin of Serbia, who reigned from 1282 to 1321, understood this better than most. His reign was long, ambitious, and uncomfortably elastic when it came to morality. A brilliant military tactician and energetic builder of churches, he was also known for switching wives, like military alliances, frequently, and without much concern for tradition, expectation, or ecclesiastical approval. Some historians claim he had as many as 5 wives over his lifetime. The church officially recognized only 2. The others were negotiated, denied, or quietly forgotten. But it's not the number of wives that concerns us here. It's one in particular, Elizabeth of Hungary. A brief union, not well documented, but significant, because Elizabeth was not just another noblewoman shuffled into royal circulation. She was, as the sources suggest, the sister of Milutin's sister-in-law. Let's slow that down. Milutin's brother, King Dragutin, had married Katharina of Hungary, a member of the Arpad dynasty, which had ruled Hungary for centuries. Katharina's sister, Elizabeth. So when Milutin married Elizabeth, he wasn't just marrying a distant cousin of his brother's wife. He was marrying her sister. It's the kind of move that seems harmless on the surface. After all, she wasn't his own sister-in-law, not directly. But in medieval canon law, and especially in the Orthodox Christian tradition Serbia adhered to, affinity through marriage was taken seriously. A sister of your brother's wife occupied a liminal space. Not blood, but not entirely free of moral proximity either. These were the grey areas where canon lawyers earned their keep and monarchs stretched the definitions. So why do it? The answer, as always, is power. At the time of Milutin's marriage to Elizabeth, the Balkans were a volatile patchwork of regional lords, imperial claimants, and foreign powers vying for influence. Marrying into the Hungarian royal house, even second-hand, offered a direct link to one of the most powerful kingdoms in the region. It was a calculated risk, designed to strengthen Serbian claims in contested borderlands and balance the influence of the Byzantine Empire to the south. Elizabeth, for her part, wasn't a passive bride. As a daughter of Stephen V of Hungary, she carried dynastic weight even if her political usefulness to Milutin proved temporary. The marriage didn't last. In fact, it may not have lasted more than a few years. Some sources imply it was annulled, others suggest it simply faded without formal closure, which is, in its own way, telling. The fact that this marriage could be so casually entered into and then just as casually erased reveals the transactional nature of in-law relationships in medieval royalty. The emotional dimension was negligible. What mattered was the alliance, the optics, the geopolitical yield. But in the long view of history, these brief, almost bureaucratic marriages leave behind awkward questions. What happens to the boundaries of kinship when political need outweighs social taboo? What does it mean to marry someone whose sister is already part of your family, someone who shares holidays, bloodlines, and, presumably, side-eye at the royal table? In Milutin's case, the answer was, it didn't matter. Not enough to stop him, not enough to prevent him from arranging yet another marriage not long after. This is a pattern, not a mistake. For Milutin, and for many monarchs like him, the in-law category was simply too valuable to leave untouched. Sisters of queens, widows of brothers, nieces of allies, these were not awkward relationships. They were strategic assets, waiting to be absorbed into the political body. And if the church protested, well, the church could be negotiated with. And so the union with Elizabeth of Hungary passed quietly into obscurity, never quite denounced, never quite celebrated. A historical footnote that exemplifies the quiet normalization of dynastic in-law marriages. Not dramatic enough to spark a scandal, but enough to blur the lines of kinship just 1 degree further. It would not be the last time the illusion of moral clarity in royal households would dissolve in the face of political necessity. In fact, elsewhere in imperial China, another ruler would take a similarly controversial step. He would desire his son's wife, and rather than deny himself or hide behind courtly discretion, he would do what emperors do best: change the definition of the relationship altogether, not by argument, but by ritual. Emperor Xuanzong formalized by forcing Yang into a Taoist veil. The Tang dynasty didn't fall in a single night. It unraveled like silk under strain, slow and dignified, until the threads holding together empire and ideology finally snapped. And if one were looking for a single moment that foreshadowed that unmaking, a single decision that quietly eroded the very foundations of dynastic order, it would be this: when Emperor Xuanzong fell in love with his daughter-in-law and changed religion, not love, to make it all go away. We've met this story before. Xuanzong, the longest reigning emperor of Tang China, ruled from 712 to 756 CE. His reign marked the peak of Tang cultural and military power, a golden age of poetry, trade, cosmopolitan luxury. But as with many golden ages, its center could not hold. And at the center of that disintegration stood a single woman, Yang Yuhuan, later known as Yang Guifei. At first, she was married to Li Mao, Xuanzong's son, a minor prince, not politically vital, but still embedded in the royal machinery. Yang Yuhuan's marriage to him was, by all appearances, typical. She was beautiful, well-connected, and quietly positioned within the extended court. But Xuanzong noticed her, and when an emperor notices, the world shifts to accommodate. The problem was not merely that Xuanzong desired his son's wife. The problem was that he did so openly. Confucian orthodoxy placed strict moral parameters on the family. The father-son relationship was sacred, not only politically, but cosmologically. The emperor was not just the head of state, but the father of the realm, and his own paternal conduct set the standard for everyone beneath him. To violate those hierarchies wasn't just scandalous, it was destabilizing. It was, quite literally, a cosmic misalignment. But instead of suppressing his desire, Xuanzong did what emperors do when confronted with inconvenient taboos. He redefined the terms. The ritual solution was both simple and shocking. Yang Yuhuan would not be demoted, disowned, or exiled. She would be tonsured, formally ordained as a Taoist nun. This was not a spiritual calling. It was a legal loophole. By entering religious life, she effectively erased her marriage to Li Mao. She was no longer his wife, no longer the emperor's daughter-in-law, no longer bound by the moral obligations of Confucian kinship. She was now, in the eyes of the law and the gods, a celestial being, unattached. Then, only after this metaphysical reset, she re-entered the court not as a royal relation, but as Xuanzong's consort. Elevated swiftly to the position of Guifei, the highest-ranked imperial concubine, Yang was given a title normally reserved for the most politically potent women in the empire. She was no longer a daughter-in-law. She was now, quite officially, the emperor's favorite. This wasn't just a personal indulgence. It was a state ritual, a cosmic performance. And the empire noticed. While court poets waxed lyrical about her beauty, comparing her skin to jade and her gait to flowing water, the bureaucrats, generals, and ministers saw something else, a dangerous precedent. Because if an emperor could erase kinship ties by changing someone's religious title, what else could be undone? The Taoist veil was not just spiritual cloth, it was an eraser, a moral reset button. It told the court, there are no limits for the emperor, not in law, not in family, not in ritual. What followed was an imperial love story drowned in irony. Xuanzong lavished Yang with palaces, jewels, and the kind of obsessive devotion that feels romantic until you remember who paid for it. The empire groaned under the weight of mismanaged funds and rampant favoritism. The Yang family, elevated by association, expanded their influence rapidly. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, rose to become chancellor. He was widely disliked. He was also dangerously incompetent. In 755, the Anlushan rebellion exploded across the empire. Sparked by regional grievances but fueled by elite resentment, the rebellion nearly toppled the Tang. Xuanzong was forced to flee the capital, and along the road to Sichuan, his own guards mutinied. Their demand was not subtle. They wanted Yang Guifei dead, the very woman who had once been a daughter-in-law, then a nun, then the most powerful woman in China, now stood accused of bringing ruin to the empire. Her elevation had symbolized everything the court feared: blurred boundaries, unchecked favoritism, and the fragility of imperial restraint. Xuanzong, after some delay, relented. Yang Guifei was killed not with ceremony, but with deliberate silence. And just like that, the woman whose status had been rewritten by religious ritual disappeared from the world she once ruled. But the ritual never disappeared. It lingered. The precedent that an emperor could use spiritual bureaucracy to dissolve moral and familial ties did not die with Yang. It became part of the imperial toolkit. A whispered reminder that, in dynastic politics, desire can be justified as long as the right incense is lit. And it wasn't just a Chinese trick. Elsewhere in the world, similar games of a final rearrangement were being played. In another Han court, long after Xuanzong's sorrowful retreat, a different emperor would marry into his own in-law clan, not through scandal, but through calculated power blocks. Because marrying into your wife's family wasn't always about love or lust. Sometimes it was about locking down a dynasty before it ever had a chance to splinter. Emperor Huan, sister block politics. In the final centuries of the Han dynasty, imperial power had grown ornamental. The emperor remained the apex of the state in name, but real authority was increasingly concentrated elsewhere in the regents, the empress's dowager, and most curiously, in the families of women. This was not a bug in the system. It was a strategy. And Emperor Huan, who ruled from 146 to 168 CE, offers a particularly revealing case study in how the logic of a final politics marrying into your wife's family was not just tolerated, but cultivated into policy. Huan did not enter the throne with force or even bloodline inevitability. He was placed there. At just 14, he was chosen by the court aristocracy and the reigning Empress Dowager Liang, not because of merit, but because of pliability. And in return for the crown, he gave up the reins. The empire, in effect, was being run not by the emperor, but by the Liang family, a powerful aristocratic bloc led by Liang Ji, the Empress Dowager's brother. That last detail matters. Because in imperial China, marrying into a single powerful family wasn't merely a personal decision, it was an administrative gamble. For the emperor, it meant embedding himself in an already functional network. For the family, it meant controlling appointments, promotions, edicts, and, in many cases, the emperor himself. To solidify this relationship, Emperor Huan was married to Liang Nuying, the younger sister of Empress Dowager Liang Na. The arrangement was neat. The emperor's bride was now the sister of the woman who had placed him on the throne. The Liang clan effectively had its hooks in every corner of court life. One sister behind the throne as dowager, another beside the throne as empress, and Liang Ji, the real strategist in front of it, controlling the bureaucracy. This wasn't just favoritism, it was structure. The idea was simple: form a sister block, a political cluster where a single family could dominate palace life through the careful placement of daughters, nieces, and wives. In doing so, they could bypass the instability of factional rivalry. If everyone in the inner court owed loyalty to the same household, the emperor would remain stable, the dynasty intact, and the bureaucracy predictable. In theory. But sister blocks, like all closed systems, breed decay. What starts as loyalty becomes monopoly. The Liang family, flush with power, became arrogant, dismissive, and violent toward rivals. Liang Ji in particular was notorious for his overreach, assassinating opponents, suppressing dissent, and essentially ruling by terror disguised as protocol. His control over the emperor was so complete that Emperor Huan was often viewed as more of a hostage than a ruler. And Liang Noying, the empress, was no powerless bystander. She ruled the inner court with the kind of authority that only imperial women could wield, unofficial but immense. Court historians later painted her as cruel, jealous, and domineering, especially toward other consorts. Her failure to produce an heir only sharpened her insecurities. Rumors circulated that she had sabotaged rival concubines' pregnancies, though these accounts often reflect posthumous scapegoating more than verifiable fact. Still, the perception was enough. The court was suffocating. Power was too concentrated. The emperor, now older and increasingly resentful, finally made his move. In 159 CE, after over a decade of Liang control, Huan allied with a group of palace eunuchs, ironically, the very class of officials the Liang family had tried to marginalize. Together, they launched a coup. Liang Ji was executed. His allies were purged. The sister bloc was dismantled. And Empress Liang Nuying? She was quietly removed from power. Some sources claim she died soon after, either by illness or by despair. The records are characteristically vague. Her fate was less dramatic than her family's, but her removal was symbolic, the fall of the entire a final system that had once defined Emperor Huan's rule. The irony is that after destroying the Liang network, Emperor Huan did not become more powerful. He merely traded one master for another. The eunuchs, emboldened by their success, grew into their own faction, arguably more corrupt and less disciplined than the family they replaced. The palace, once ruled by sisters, was now run by whispers behind carved screens and bribes passed through silk sleeves. But the real lesson lies in what the Liang sister bloc represented. It was a system of dynastic control based not on war or wealth, but on affinity, not blood, but marriage. By placing daughters and sisters into the emperor's household, a single clan could control succession, law, and ceremony. It was the soft power of proximity, the politics of pillow talk. And in imperial China, it often proved more durable than armies. And the Liangs were not alone. This wasn't an isolated strategy, it was part of a global pattern. Because halfway across the world, in the Khmer Empire, another ruler was also using marital affinity to consolidate power. But instead of marrying into a powerful family, he simply married both sisters, his wife, and her replacement, turning affection into administration and siblinghood into statecraft. Jayavarman VII, Queen's policy. In the humid grandeur of Angkor, where sandstone temples rose like memory made permanent and dynasties were etched into the very geometry of the jungle, King Jayavarman VII ruled not just as a monarch but as a transformation. The Khmer Empire had seen kings before, warrior kings, temple builders, Hindu demigods in royal garb. But Jayavarman was something else entirely, a Buddhist monarch in a land steeped in Shiva's shadow, a reformer who wielded both sword and sutra, a ruler who didn't just use religion to justify power, he used marriage. Strategically, symbolically, structurally. And in Jayavarman's world, few symbols were more politically potent than his wives, two sisters whose presence at the heart of the court allowed him to forge a dynasty, a state religion, and a kind of emotional continuity that spanned temples, inscriptions, and generations. The story begins with Jayarajadevi, the king's first wife, and a devoted patron of Mahayana Buddhism. Her presence in Jayavarman's early rule was more than ornamental. She was a cultural partner, a spiritual counterpart, and, according to several Khmer inscriptions, an active participant in the religious life of the court. Together, they weren't simply king and queen. They were a doctrinal pair, a bodhisattva in royal form, and the queen who echoed his compassion. But Jayarajadevi died young. And what came next was not a political reset, but a political continuity. Jayavarman married Indra Devi, Jayarajadevi's sister. To modern sensibilities, this might feel like a private decision, an act of grief, perhaps, a way to keep the flame alive by marrying someone close, familiar, emotionally adjacent. But in the Khmer court, personal affection was never unmoored from strategy. Indra Devi wasn't just a convenient replacement, she was an extension of Jayavarman's ideological project. Both sisters came from high-ranking aristocratic stock. Their father was likely a Brahmin, a learned member of the intellectual elite, steeped in the Sanskritic traditions that blended seamlessly into the Cambodian courts of the time. In marrying Jayarajadevi, Jayavarman had tethered himself to a family of religious legitimacy. In marrying Indra Devi, he preserved that link, reinforcing his court's alignment with Buddhist philosophy and maintaining the same factional support without interruption. And Indra Devi was no silent consort. She was educated likely at the famed Royal Academy of Nalanda in India, and she didn't just sit beside Jayavarman on temple walls. She issued inscriptions of her own, she commissioned temples, she praised her sister's memory in carefully worded stelae that honored the past while legitimizing her present role. In one particularly famous inscription, she refers to her late sister as a queen, reborn in heaven, and herself as the earthly continuation of that wisdom and virtue. It was an extraordinary rhetorical move. She wasn't just stepping into her sister's household, she was stepping into her sister's spiritual lineage. This was not a simple case of familial recycling, it was dynastic succession by affinity. The appearance of marital continuity served a deeper, more political purpose. Stability in the inner court, consistency in public ritual, and legitimacy in the eyes of both the priestly elite and the people. And it worked. Jayavarman VII's reign 1181–1218 CE became one of the most ambitious in Khmer history. He led massive building campaigns, constructed more than 100 hospitals, restored roads, and launched temple projects on a near-messianic scale. His most famous creation, Bayon, sits at the center of Angkor Thom, with giant stone faces smiling enigmatically from every tower. But those faces weren't just deities. They were reflections of the king himself, a kind of soft propaganda carved into eternity. And throughout this era of imperial transformation, Indra Devi remained by his side, as queen, as sister-in-law, as successor, as symbol. Their marriage functioned as a masterclass in political messaging. We are not starting over. The queen may have changed, but the dynasty remains unbroken. The family line remains pure. The religion remains stable. And the king? The king remains exactly where he belongs, at the center of a universe held together not just by gods, but by sisters. And this is the unnerving part. What seems, at first, like a quaint dynastic romance is actually a profound example of how in-law relationships were used to control narrative. The transition from one sister to another wasn't just convenient, it was strategic reinforcement. In Khmer culture, where divine kingship and statecraft overlapped entirely, the role of the queen wasn't about affection, it was about theology, legitimacy, and the public performance of balance. Indra Devi became both queen and memory, the living echo of a former wife, a vessel for continuity, a politically acceptable way to keep the same family and therefore the same court faction in power. And this pattern wasn't unique to Cambodia. All across the ancient world, monarchs married their in-laws not to disrupt dynastic order, but to preserve it. Sisters, daughters-in-law, even widowed queens, each could be repurposed, repositioned, rebranded. Which brings us to Egypt, a kingdom where such political recycling didn't just occur, it was ritualized. There, in the house of Ptolemy, the lines between sibling and in-law didn't blur, they vanished entirely. Ptolemy II, when your in-law is also your sibling. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not believe in drawing lines. Not between nations, not between temples and throne rooms, and certainly not between siblings and spouses. In the Egyptian court of the 3rd century BCE, political control was maintained through rituals of closeness, familial, religious, architectural. One of the most potent of these rituals came from a man whose legacy was both monumental and morally inverted, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the sibling-loving king. And while he is often remembered for commissioning the famous Library of Alexandria and transforming Egypt into a cultural lighthouse of the Hellenistic world, Ptolemy II's most enduring and unnerving legacy was his marriage to Arsinoe II, who was his full sister. But before she was his sister wife, she was also his sister-in-law. To understand how that's even possible, we have to start with Arsinoe's first husband, Ptolemy Keraounos. He was Ptolemy II's half-brother, the disgruntled son of Ptolemy I Soter by another marriage, and a brutal, opportunistic claimant to the Macedonian throne. Arsinoe married him not out of affection, but because politics demanded it. She was a daughter of Egypt, he was a king in the north, and dynastic marriages often ran on the fumes of obligation. It didn't go well. Keraounos eventually killed her sons, his stepsons, in a bid to consolidate power. Arsinoe fled back to Egypt, a political refugee with the royal equivalent of a scarlet letter, a former queen, a survivor, a widow whose past alliances had ended in blood. Most dynasties would have locked her away quietly, let her fade into the architecture, far from the throne and the annals. But the Ptolemies did not operate that way. Where other rulers saw scandal, Ptolemy II saw opportunity. Where others would have closed ranks, he opened the royal household. Arsinoe returned not just to Egypt, but to the center of power, and soon after, she was married to her own brother. But here's the double bind. Because she had previously been married to Ptolemy II's half-brother, she also held the title of his sister-in-law. In other words, Arsinoe was both sibling and in-law. By marrying her, Ptolemy II wasn't just entering into a politically controversial union, he was doubling down on taboo, folding two layers of familial proximity into one official position. It was breathtaking in its audacity, and the court, predictably, didn't blink. Because by that point the Ptolemaic ideology had moved beyond mere governance. They were crafting something more dangerous, a theology of royalty. The Egyptian pharaonic tradition had long embraced divine kingship, including sibling marriage among deities like Isis and Osiris. The Ptolemies, Foreigners ruling an Egyptian people needed to legitimize their control, and what better way than to insert themselves directly into the divine mythos? So Ptolemy and Arsinoe became living gods. They were deified as the Theoi Adelphoi. The sibling gods and coins were minted with their conjoined profiles, not side by side, but overlaid, faces turned slightly as if looking into eternity. Temples were dedicated to their union. Inscriptions praised the harmony of their bloodline. Their marriage, far from being concealed, was amplified, publicized. A spectacle not of love, but of legitimacy. But beneath the gold and granite was a deeper political message. We do not dilute power. We do not marry out. We do not let external bloodlines contaminate the throne. The royal family becomes its own self-sustaining system. Sibling, spouse, in-law. They are not categories. They are strategies. And Arsinoe, for her part, wasn't merely a consort. She became co-ruler. Her name appeared on official decrees. Her influence shaped foreign policy. She was praised in cultic hymns and ceremonial dedications. She wasn't remembered as a woman recycled through dynastic necessity. She was remembered as a goddess. But not everyone approved. In the wider Hellenistic world, especially among the more traditional Greek elites, the marriage was seen as decadent, even dangerous. The Greeks had their own familial taboos, and while royal marriages often bent those rules, marrying a sibling who was also your in-law felt like something out of a tragic play, one with a cursed ending. And perhaps that's why the Ptolemies leaned so hard into religious symbolism. They weren't trying to defend the union. They were replacing the moral framework that would have judged it. If the gods could marry their sisters, so could kings. And if those sisters had also been married to previous claimants, all the better. It reinforced the narrative of dynastic inevitability. This logic would repeat itself for generations. Ptolemaic rulers after Philadelphus would continue the practice, folding siblings and in-laws into each new marriage as if they were the same thing. The dynasty became a loop, a circle where power never left the family, not by marriage, not by blood, not even by scandal. And centuries later, in dusty manuscripts and Byzantine commentaries, this double marriage of sibling and sister-in-law was still discussed not with revulsion, but with something closer to awe, a kind of grudging admiration for the sheer efficiency of it. But the cost of that efficiency was immense. A dynasty that refused to diversify genetically, politically, emotionally, eventually collapsed under the weight of its own perfection. Still, the strategy of using affinity to justify royal desire didn't die with the Ptolemies. In fact, it would resurface in Tudor England, where Henry VIII, having already torn through one sister-in-law, circled back to justify the entire English Reformation on the theological implications of another. Because even in the most modern courts, the question kept returning. Was marrying your brother's wife an act of love or an offense against God? Henry VIII, Theology of Affinity. For a man obsessed with sons, Henry VIII sure spent a lot of time arguing with priests. His reign, which began with jousts and coronations, slowly devolved into something far stranger, a courtroom drama starring popes, bishops, translators, lawyers, and a rotating cast of increasingly nervous wives. And at the heart of that drama, beneath the annulments, executions, and ecclesiastical reforms, was a single, deceptively simple question. Is it a sin to marry your brother's wife? To Henry, the answer was yes, or rather, it became yes at a very convenient time. We've already seen how his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was entangled from the beginning. Catherine had been the wife of his older brother, Arthur Tudor, the Prince of Wales. Their marriage was arranged, political, and according to Catherine, never consummated. Arthur died young, leaving Catherine a teenage widow and Henry a teenage heir. The two were eventually wed in what was supposed to be a stable, uncontroversial union to preserve the Anglo-Spanish alliance. But that alliance began to fray as time passed and no male heir arrived, and Henry, whose conscience often moved in parallel with his political needs, began to see the marriage as cursed, not just unfortunate, cursed. The justification he reached for wasn't new. It came straight from Leviticus 20:21, which reads, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." To Henry, this was not poetic language. It was legal, binding, divine. He saw his lack of male heirs not as biological chance or personal fault, but as proof of divine displeasure. God had punished him, Henry believed, for violating a spiritual boundary. He had married his brother's widow, and the womb of the marriage had been closed as punishment. This was not a new line of thought, but Henry turned it into a national crisis. In 1527, he formally requested an annulment from the Pope, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was invalid due to this biblical commandment. The argument was theological on the surface, but underneath it was the gnawing political anxiety. Without a male heir, the Tudor line could die with him. And Henry, whose ego was matched only by his insecurity, could not allow that. The problem: the Pope had already granted a dispensation years earlier. When Henry and Catherine first wed, the Vatican approved the union precisely because of its controversial nature. Canon law had long held that such a marriage was normally prohibited, but the Church could make exceptions. It had made one, and the marriage had gone forward under papal blessing. Now, Henry wanted to undo that blessing. The debate that followed spiraled into one of the most consequential legal and religious battles in European history. Scholars were called, treatises written, universities consulted. Some argued that the biblical law was absolute, papal dispensation or not. Others pointed to Deuteronomy 25:5, which seemed to encourage a man to marry his brother's widow in order to raise up seed for the brother's name. If anything, the Bible seemed contradictory on the matter. Henry, of course, took a side. He launched an intellectual campaign to paint himself not as a lustful monarch chasing annulment, but as a pious king desperately trying to live in accordance with divine law. He funded scholars, he pushed theologians, he whispered doubts into the ears of bishops, and threatened those who didn't fall in line. At the center of this theological hurricane was Catherine, quietly insisting that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. If true, the Levitical prohibition wouldn't apply. But Henry, whose doubts had hardened into dogma, refused to accept her word. His mind was already elsewhere. On Anne Boleyn, on an heir, on a church that didn't answer to Rome. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry broke from the Catholic Church entirely. The English Reformation was born not out of doctrinal clarity or theological conviction, but out of a final ambiguity. A question of in-laws had become a matter of state. A line in Leviticus had torn a continent apart. And yet, the irony of it all is almost too clean. The very man who used biblical law to invalidate his marriage to Catherine, a union with his brother's widow, had himself already slept with Anne Boleyn's sister, Mary, which, by the same logic, should have disqualified him from marrying Anne. The Church considered sexual relations with a woman's sister the same as with the woman herself. Affinity by carnal knowledge, they called it, and it was as binding as blood. But that part of the Bible, Henry conveniently forgot. Or perhaps more accurately, he had it quietly ignored. So what did we learn? That the theology of affinity is never just about sex or sanctity. It's about power, about legitimacy. about how kings use scripture the way a sculptor uses marble, chiseling away at inconvenient verses until only the desired shape remains. The doctrine that unraveled Europe was built on the question of in-laws, not enemies, not heretics, not infidels. In-laws. And while Henry's theological gymnastics made headlines, his case was far from unique. Because on the other side of the world in the Hawaiian archipelago, marrying your in-laws wasn't a moral crisis. It was cultural continuity. It was how you held the throne. Court of Hawaii. One chief, sisters, one throne. Before the missionaries came with their printed Bibles and waistcoats, before the sugar barons planted monoculture and imported diseases, before annexation was a gleam in Washington's eye, Hawaii had its own order. Not chaos, not savagery, but a highly stratified system of sacred rule, where bloodline wasn't just a pedigree, it was divine architecture. And in this system, where lineage was the very scaffolding of legitimacy, the question of who a chief could marry had only one real answer. Someone close enough to maintain the mana. Mana, the spiritual power that permeated everything in ancient Hawaiian life, was not democratic. It didn't flow freely to the masses. It was concentrated, carefully passed through generations of alii, nurtured like a flame. To preserve this sacred potency, intermarriage wasn't discouraged. It was required. Enter the royal practice that European observers would describe with scandalized curiosity: marrying sisters. Not metaphorically, literally, and not once, but as a recurring method of keeping mana undiluted, land consolidated, and the throne secured against rival claims. This wasn't a loophole, it was policy. And at the center of it stood Kamehameha I, the unifier of the Hawaiian Islands, and the man whose marital arrangements offer a particularly vivid case study in the politics of in-law entwinement. Kamehameha took 3 sisters as wives: Kaahumanu, Kalakua, Kahehaimali, and Namahanapia. Each was of chiefly blood. Each a daughter of influential lineages, and each a sister-in-law to the others, which is to say, each was simultaneously a political alliance and a familial entrenchment. The domestic circle became the court. The bedchamber became a council chamber. Let's not misread this through a European lens. These marriages were not aberrations, nor were they the result of royal whimsy. They were calculated dynastic strategies. By taking these sisters, Kamehameha wasn't simply fulfilling romantic or reproductive imperatives. He was building a coalition of lineages, solidifying loyalty from different high-ranking houses across the islands, and reinforcing the sacred nature of his own claim to kingship. And while Kaahumanu became his most famous wife, eventually rising to the role of Kuhinanui, co-regent or premier, wielding near equal authority alongside the king, each sister played a role in the architecture of power. Kalakua Kahehaimali would become the mother of future high-ranking nobles, while Namahanapia's connections bound Kamehameha to other influential Ali'i houses in Maui. To the outsider, these unions may look incestuous, but that's not how they functioned in the Hawaiian worldview. The Ali'i class was not just ruling through strength or conquest. They ruled through genealogical clarity, a system that rewarded purity of line and closeness of blood as signs of divine right. In this context, sister-in-law marriages were not merely accepted, they were revered. The closer the relationship, the greater the mana. It was the inverse of the European Christian framework, where Leviticus ruled against uncovering a brother's nakedness and where affinity created permanent spiritual boundaries. In Hawaii, affinity through marriage was a tool, a way to loop mana through a dynasty again and again, preserving it like a closed circuit. It wasn't just Kamehameha. The pattern was endemic to elite courts. Chiefs and chiefesses regularly married within their own extended families. Sometimes full siblings, sometimes half-siblings, and very often in-laws, by marriage. The system wasn't broken, it was refined, capable of weaving complicated alliances across islands without ceding power to external bloodlines. European missionaries were horrified. They interpreted these marriages through their own doctrines and labeled them immoral, backward, or sinful. And eventually, they succeeded in convincing Hawaiian rulers to abandon the practice first as symbolic reform, then as cultural surrender. The arrival of Christianity began the slow erosion of this indigenous political structure, culminating in the broader Western colonization of Hawaiian law, land, and identity. But long before the gospel ships docked, the alii understood what most rulers only pretended to believe, that marriage was statecraft and that in-law relationships weren't secondary, they were central. Each sister-in-law taken into the royal household was not just a wife, she was a vote of confidence, a blood bond, a fortification. The court of Hawaii, in that sense, was no different from the courts of England, France, China, or Egypt. The robes were different, the rituals distinct, but the logic unmistakably familiar. And like all ruling houses across history, the Hawaiians weren't just marrying for mana or inheritance, they were recycling power, returning it to the same bloodlines, holding it tightly and refusing to let it drift into the hands of strangers. A pattern we've now seen from the Ptolemies to the Tudors, from Angkor to Versailles, from the deserts of Judea to the rainforests of Polynesia. And if we were to step back, zoom out far enough to see the entire map, we'd realize that these royal in-law entanglements weren't random anomalies. They were symptoms of a broader historical instinct. Keep it in the family, whatever the cost. Because whether through scandal or sacrament, bedroom or battlefield, dynasties survive not by expansion, but by recursion. The big pattern. Keep it in the family. By now, the pattern should be hard to ignore. Across empires and centuries, across languages, religions, and legal systems, monarchs and dynasties have bent and occasionally broken their own moral codes in pursuit of a simple, ruthless idea. Power is safest when it doesn't leave the family. And if that meant marrying a sister-in-law, bedding a brother's widow, or inviting a daughter-in-law into the imperial bedchamber, so be it. The crown, after all, has always been a jealous god. This wasn't about romance. It was rarely about desire, even when couched in poetic seduction or religious ceremony. This was about containment, control, dynastic recursion as a form of political insurance, and the in-law by accident of proximity was the perfect solution to an ancient problem. How do you expand your lineage without expanding your liability? Take Judea, for instance. Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus didn't just marry into their own bloodlines, they married into each other's households, keeping the royal tent flapping safely in the same wind. Herodias, Glyphera, and other royal women became political chess pieces, passed from brother to brother like inherited territory. The house of Herod read Leviticus carefully, but then quietly footnoted it with ambition. In Ptolemaic Egypt, theological gymnastics weren't even necessary. Incest and affinity were baked into the system. When Ptolemy II married Arsinoe II, he wasn't just defying moral expectations, he was codifying them into religion. By marrying a woman who was both his full sister and his half-brother's widow, he closed the loop entirely. Their union wasn't a scandal, it was a blueprint. Imperial China took a slightly more bureaucratic approach. Emperors like Xuanzong and Huan didn't just want to marry into powerful families, they wanted to manage those families. A daughter-in-law? Make her a consort. A sister-in-law? Promote her into a ritual role. And if anyone raised an eyebrow, you could always make her a Taoist nun first. As long as the paperwork aligned, the throne remained undisturbed. The Khmer Empire refined this logic into a philosophy. Jayavarman VII's marriage to his first wife's sister wasn't a workaround, it was a continuation. The crown didn't move. The queen simply changed faces, keeping the same family, the same advisors, the same religious alignment. In-law intimacy as institutional memory. And then there's Henry VIII, the man who turned biblical ambiguity into constitutional crisis. His obsession with Catherine of Aragon and his retroactive guilt about her being his brother's widow wasn't about divine displeasure. It was about inheritance, about the terrifying possibility of a crown without a son. The result? A national schism, a new church, a new theology of marriage rooted entirely in the paranoia of affinity. The French court under Louis XIV dressed it all up in silk and candlelight, but the strategy was the same. Henrietta of England, his sister-in-law, wasn't just a forbidden flirtation, she was politically dangerous because she sat at the intersection of diplomacy and proximity. Versailles could spin gold out of sin, but even the Sun King couldn't fully eclipse the optics of fraternal betrayal. And in Hawaii, the in-law dynamic wasn't shameful, it was sacred. The Alii class married sisters as a strategy of mana preservation. Affinity wasn't a problem to solve, it was a tool to wield. Marrying your sister-in-law wasn't a scandal, it was a safeguard. What do all of these rulers have in common? They saw the throne not as a seat, but as a closed circuit. Power had to flow in a circle, never in a straight line. Affines, those legally or ceremonially bound to the family, were as useful as bloodkin, sometimes even more so. They brought new connections without the risk of total foreignness. And because they were already close, they didn't need to be trusted from scratch. They had already passed the first test, being there. But here's the paradox. The very strategy designed to stabilize royal power also made it vulnerable. The more the family folded in on itself, the more resentments curdled in closed chambers. The more sisters became rivals. The more brothers competed for widows. The more the crown relied on in-laws, the more it turned on them. Think of Anne Boleyn. Think of Yang Guifei. Think of Elizabeth of Hungary. Power passed to them not by design but by proximity. And proximity in royal courts is a double-edged blade. In the end, marrying in-laws didn't just keep power close. It exposed how fragile that power really was. It showed how royalty, despite the gold and pageantry, was always teetering on the edge of intimacy and betrayal. And no matter the empire, no matter the era, the line between divine right and dynastic collapse was drawn in the bedrooms of the palace. So the next time you see a royal wedding, whether in a tabloid or a temple, look closer. Ask yourself not just who married whom, but why they were allowed to marry at all. And then remember this. It was never just love. It was never just law. It was always about keeping it in the family.